Chapter 1727. Chu Fengmian had obtained countless resources in the Sword Dao sect, and they were all hidden in the palaces. The moment the disciples of the 7 major sects rushed in, they saw a dazzling array of treasures in the palaces. Their eyes were incomparably greedy as they rushed in and plundered in large quantities. Burning, killing, looting. They were like bandits who had walked into a treasury and began to plunder mercilessly. Han Yueli, Luo Shi, Qing Meng, Emperor Yan, and the others all stood together and joined forces to resist the countless attacks. However, under the joint bombardment of the 15 invincible emperors, their joint forces began to lose ground. The power of any invincible emperors was incomparably terrifying, not to mention the joint forces of 15 invincible emperors. Even with Qing Meng's talent and countless opportunities, it was already the limit for her to fight against 2 invincible emperors. But now, there were 15 of them. This kind of power was enough to make one despair. Waves of spiritual energy fluctuations rang out in the Sword Dao sect. Countless defensive arrays set up in the Sword Dao sect were activated one after another, preparing for the final battle. The gate has been broken. Chu Fengmian, who was in the palace, suddenly opened his eyes. He could clearly feel that the gate of the Sword Dao sect had been broken. But now, he could not escape. He had reached the last step of the bottleneck. He had to take this step to truly step into the realm of the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu. If he stopped at this time, not only would he lose this opportunity to break through, but he might also suffer a backlash. The arrow on the bow had to be shot. Break for me. Rumble. Powerful dragon power erupted from Chu Fengmian's body, tearing apart the shackles on his body. Every time a hole was torn, Chu Fengmian condensed the Dragon Emperor blood essence. The Dragon Emperor's blood essence in his body had already reached 9,999 drops. He was only one step away from condensing 10,000 drops. Don't tangle with these trash. That Chu Fengmian? Where is he? On the other side, a figure flashed out from the crowd that was besieging Han Yueli, Luo Shi, and the others. It was Donggong Li. His gaze suddenly swept across the entire Sword Dao sect, frantically searching for Chu Fengmian's figure. The Sword Dao sect was established by Chu Fengmian with his own strength. Their goal this time wasn't just to destroy the Sword Dao sect. Their true goal was to kill Chu Fengmian. Look, the dragon's might is coming from underground. Another old man's figure appeared, and the withered leaf also came out. It looked around and suddenly looked down at the ground. When they came to the Sword Dao gate, they could feel that Chu Fengmian's dragon power came from underground. Go! Kill him! Whoosh! Donggong Li and Ku Ye's figures flickered as they flew towards the underground. 10,000 meters underground was an unreachable area for mortals. However, Donggong Li and Ku Ye, who were both invincible sovereigns, didn't care about it at all. In an instant, 2 streams of spiritual energy shot into the ground. The 10,000 meters underground was immediately torn apart, and suddenly, a majestic palace came into their sight. The source of the dragon's might was in this palace. This kid is in the palace. Smash him. Kill that kid and capture him alive. He is now breaking through and has no ability to resist. It's a good opportunity to capture him alive. Ku Yi and Donggong Li conversed, then the 2 of them gathered their spiritual energy and attacked at the same time. A sword light and a fist wind blasted out at the same time, bombarding the palace's gate. Rumble. The whole palace began to shake violently because of the bombardment of the 2 forces. However, Chu Fengmian, who was sitting inside, didn't move. All his thoughts and attention were focused on breaking through. Even if the sky fell, it wouldn't affect Chu Fengmian's consciousness. The power of the sword light and the fist wind blasted the palace, causing many cracks to appear on the palace's surface. Just as the palace was about to shatter, a golden sword light suddenly appeared above the palace's gate. It was this sword light that emitted a shocking sword intent, forcibly repairing the countless cracks on the palace's gate. Extreme sword seal? Ku Yi and Donggong Li exclaimed at the same time when they saw the golden sword light. Their eyes were filled with shock. The extreme sword seal was something that only a few young people in this era knew about. However, 10,000 years ago, the extreme sword seal was famous. It was the symbol of the former master of sword principle. Only the master of sword principle himself and his disciples were qualified to control the seal. 10,000 years ago, even the geniuses of the 7 great sects had to retreat when they saw the extreme sword seal. They didn't dare to provoke it. This kid can even control the extreme sword seal. He must have just obtained an inheritance. Kuye's eyes were filled with excitement. The more mysterious Chu Fengmian's identity was, the more beneficial it would be for them. Chu Fengmian might even know the countless secrets and treasures of the Sword Principle sect. The master of Sword Principle is already dead. How can this puny extreme sword seal stop us? Break it! Dong Gongli was also extremely excited. He smiled sinisterly and immediately condensed spiritual energy on his fist wind. Rumble! He threw out a punch and it collided with the extreme sword seal in the air. The extreme sword seal was indeed very powerful. This was because the extreme sword seal used to represent the power of the master of sword principle. Now that the master of sword principle was dead, the power of the extreme sword seal could no longer be compared to 10,000 years ago. When the punch landed, the small golden sword collided with the force of the fist wind in the air. With a loud bang, the small golden sword shook violently. In the next moment, it shattered. The extreme sword seal was broken. Withered Leaf seized this opportunity and rushed toward the palace. The sword in his hand slashed down and slashed at the door of the palace. Crack! After losing the extreme sword seal, the palace couldn't withstand such a powerful force. The gate of the palace was directly broken. The palace was broken. Now that he was outside, he was able to see Chu Fengmian, who was seated inside, and the countless illusory figures behind him. Capture him! Sacred Tower of the Ancients. Dong Gongli condensed spiritual energy on his palm and suddenly grabbed at Chu Fengmian. The spiritual energy in his palm suddenly condensed into a 7-story pagoda and suppressed Chu Fengmian. Chapter 1728. The 7-floored pagoda formed by the power of the ancients descended from the sky and enveloped Chu Fengmian. The tyrannical power of the ancients seemed to be suppressing Chu Fengmian under the pagoda, preventing him from escaping for all eternity. Withered Leaf attacked at the same time. The sword in his hand flashed and suddenly turned into chains of spiritual power that wrapped around Chu Fengmian. The two worked together seamlessly. Boom! The two worked together to seal Chu Fengmian's power. The bottleneck that Chu Fengmian was about to break through seemed to be shackled one after another. However, Chu Fengmian's expression did not change at all. Behind him, the shadow of a huge sacred tree condensed. Chu Fengmian sat under the shadow of the divine tree, and no power seemed to be able to shake him. It was an almost invincible defense. The sacred tree! Dong Gongli's eyes turned red when he saw the shadow of the sacred tree behind Chu Fengmian. The sacred tree was a sapling that once grew in the ancient Desolation sect. It was carefully cultivated by the ancient Desolation sect and was originally intended to be subdued by the experts of the ancient Desolation sect. However, Chu Fengmian snuck into the sacred tree's secret realm and took it away from him. Seeing that Chu Fengmian had subdued the sacred tree and possessed such tyrannical power, Dong Gongli's eyes were filled with jealousy. It's just a shadow of the sacred tree. I don't believe it can protect you. Today, no matter who comes, you will die. Dong Gongli roared and condensed spiritual power on his fist. Suddenly, he threw a punch at Chu Fengmian. A tunnel suddenly opened above Dong Gongli's head. Endless ancient power surged out from the tunnel. The power gathered together with the fist wind in Dong Gongli's hand. It was as if a punch that transcended time and space. Suddenly, it bombarded the shadow of the sacred tree. Even the shadow of the tree of God was shaken by this punch. Withered Leaf attacked at the same time. The sword in his hand flashed continuously and suddenly slashed at Chu Fengmian. The moment the sword aura bombarded the divine tree shadow, countless cracks appeared on the divine tree shadow. In the next moment, the divine tree shadow was destroyed. The shadow of the divine tree was broken. The defense on Chu Fengmian's body seemed to have completely disappeared. He stood alone in front of the two of them. "It's over." Dong Gongli smiled sinisterly. He didn't give Chu Fengmian any time to catch his breath. The sacred tower of the ancients came crashing down on Chu Fengmian's body. Under the suppression of the sacred tower of the ancients, Chu Fengmian's aura became weaker and weaker. His body kept shrinking, as if he was about to be suppressed at the bottom of the tower. Dragon Monarch. Creation. Divine Tree. Immortal. Chu Fengmian's voice suddenly came from the bottom of the tower. With every voice that rang out, Chu Fengmian's aura seemed to become even more tyrannical. "Not good, this brat is about to break through." Seeing this scene, Withered Leaf's expression changed greatly. "Even if you break through now, you won't be able to escape the fate of being suppressed. The Great Tao of Desolation. Suppress." Dong Gongli's face was incomparably ferocious. At this moment, the great path of the ancients under his feet suddenly turned into a ray of light and flew out. The great path of the ancients turned into a ray of light and flew into the sacred tower of the ancients. It wanted to suppress Chu Fengmian with the endless power of the ancients. Chu Fengmian's aura seemed to be weakening under the suppression. But at this moment, Chu Fengmian's body suddenly moved. On the shadow of the Dragon Monarch behind him, a drop of Dragon Monarch blood essence condensed again. 10,000 drops of Dragon Monarch blood essence. The moment this drop of Dragon Monarch blood essence condensed, Chu Fengmian's power underwent an incredible change. The shackles that had been shackling Chu Fengmian all this time were suddenly torn apart. At this moment, Chu Fengmian's realm had officially stepped into the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. "I've finally broken through." Chu Fengmian's eyes lit up with joy. The bottleneck that he had been unable to break through all this time was finally broken at this moment. Under the siege of these two people, under such a dangerous situation, Chu Fengmian's potential was further stimulated. Chu Fengmian directly broke through and truly stepped into the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness shrouded the entire Sword Dao sect. Seeing the countless battles within, his eyes were extremely cold. Today, no one who dares to come to the Sword Dao sect will leave alive. The moment Chu Fengmian's cold voice was heard, Withered Leaf and Dong Gongli seemed to be stunned. A chill surged into their hearts. "So what if you've broken through?" "Even if you've broken through, you're only at the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. You still can't escape. Kid, I want you to see with your own eyes how the Sword Dao sect that you built will be destroyed. Also, how did your woman die in my hands?" Dong Gongli sneered malevolently. Once again, he activated the power of the sacred tower of the ancients to suppress Chu Fengmian. A martial artist was at his weakest when he had just broken through. Now that Chu Fengmian had truly broken through and stepped into the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, Dong Gongli didn't panic. Instead, he was elated. Chu Fengmian's breakthrough at this time was no different from giving him an opportunity. Withered Leaf also knew this. The sword light in his hand gathered together with the sacred tower of the ancients and suppressed Chu Fengmian. Looking at the sacred tower of the ancients that was suppressing him, Chu Fengmian's face was extremely calm. However, in Chu Fengmian's eyes, a hint of killing intent was constantly gathering. He looked up at the sky, at the sacred tower of the ancients that was suppressing him. Suddenly, his hand moved and blasted out a palm. Rumble! The dragons roared. The moment the palm blasted out, a huge amount of dragon power gathered on it and turned into a dragon claw that swept out. Primogenitor's second move. Crack! When the dragon claw slammed into the sacred tower of the ancients, the sacred tower of the ancients was shattered and countless cracks appeared on its surface. In the next moment, the sacred tower was mercilessly crushed by the dragon claw and turned into countless fragments that drifted in the air. Chu Fengmian's figure slowly walked out of the palace. Looking at the messy palace, a hint of killing intent appeared in Chu Fengmian's eyes. "Today, I'll start with the two of you. I'll use your blood to pay tribute to the Sword Dao sect." Chu Fengmian shouted coldly and immediately unsheathed the Titanic Gate Divine Sword. A sword light that was tens of thousands of feet long burst out from the tip of Chu Fengmian's sword and slashed towards Donggong Li in withered leaf. The sharpness of this sword light was unstoppable. Chapter 1729. As the sword slashed out, the surrounding space began to shatter. The power of the sword ray made withered leaf and Donggong Li's expressions change as they quickly retreated. At the same time, the two of them also unleashed their respective abilities. They unleashed martial skills that filled the sky in an attempt to block the 10,000 Jianwang sword ray. However, the sword ray was invincible. All kinds of killing moves could not stop the sword ray at all. In an instant, all the killing moves in the sky were drawn into the sword ray and were completely devoured in the next moment. What? How can this person be so powerful? Seeing the countless killing moves being completely neutralized, their faces were full of shock. Although they had heard of Chu Fengmian's strength before coming here, in their opinion, Chu Fengmian was only an 8 Tribulation Emperor Gu. Even if he had broken through now, he would only be a 9 Tribulation Emperor Gu, which was nothing at all. From the beginning, they did not put Chu Fengmian in their eyes. However, after this exchange of blows, they realized that their previous thoughts were all wrong. Chu Fengmian's strength was far beyond their imagination. The two of them, who were invincible emperors, could not even shake Chu Fengmian's sword ray when they joined forces. Retreat quickly. Whoosh! Donggong Li and Withered Leaf looked at each other, then turned around and retreated. The two of them immediately reacted. Chu Fengmian's strength was far from what the two of them could contend with. Only by gathering the experts of the 7 major sects and besieging Chu Fengmian would they have a chance to kill him. The two of them retreated continuously, then turned into a ray of light and flew directly into the sky. You want to run away in front of me? Chu Fengmian's cold voice suddenly resounded just as the two of them were about to leave. Both of them were startled by his words. This voice seemed to have suddenly sounded from behind them. Get back here! Rumble! An incomparably huge dragon claw suddenly broke through the space and clawed at their backs. A huge suction force shrouded the two of them. The Great Tao of Desolation. Donggong Li's expression changed. He let out a long roar and ancient power gathered under his feet, turning into a desolate great path. He stood on the desolate great path, trying to stay out of the battle and avoid the claw of the war dragon. Chu Fengmian laughed coldly as he looked at the great Tao of the primordial ancients. Suddenly, he pointed at it, transforming it into a beam of light that shot toward Donggong Li. Crack! Chu Fengmian's light beam struck Donggong Li's body and the desolate ancient path beneath his feet shattered abruptly. Chu Fengmian had also dragged his body back from the primordial desolation. Before Donggong Meng could react, the battle dragon claw had already landed on him and he was enveloped by the battle dragon claw. When Chu Fengmian was in the realm of the 8 Tribulations Emperor Gu, he could already easily kill the invincible sovereigns. Now that Chu Fengmian had stepped into the realm of the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu, his strength was more than 10 times stronger than when he was in the realm of the 8 Tribulations Emperor Gu. After 10,000 drops of Dragon Emperor blood essence were condensed, a drastic change took place in Chu Fengmian's body. 10,000 drops of Dragon Emperor blood essence were arranged in Chu Fengmian's body and condensed into a large spirit array. It was this spirit array that gave Chu Fengmian almost endless power. Previously, Chu Fengmian had to find the weakness of the desolate great path to deal with it. But now, Chu Fengmian could break it with a casual blow. Suppress. Looking at Donggong Li, who was caught in the claw of the war dragon, Chu Fengmian sneered. He gathered the power of dragon pressure and slammed it down. The tyrannical dragon pressure firmly suppressed Donggong Li's body, making him unable to even use his spirit energy. He was firmly pressed under the claw of the war dragon, unable to move. With one move, the current leader of the desolate ancient sect disciples, Donggong Li, who was said to be invincible in the Emperor realm, was suppressed by Chu Fengmian. Seeing all this, Withered Leaf's eyes were filled with horror. Before his escape light could leave, Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and appeared in front of Withered Leaf in an instant. This figure was so fast that even Withered Leaf could not see it clearly. Withered Leaf, you actually joined the Supreme Sword Sect? Chu Fengmian looked at Withered Leaf with an extremely cold gaze. Withered Leaf was once a disciple of the Sword Dao sect. He did not become a disciple of the Master of Sword Dao. Instead, he only learned sword techniques in the Sword Dao sect. There were tens of thousands of disciples in the Sword Dao sect. Including Chu Fengmian, there were only a few dozen disciples who were truly apprenticed to the Master of Sword Dao. Most of the others were not apprenticed to the Master of Sword Dao, but they were enough to learn countless sword techniques in the Sword Dao sect. Withered Leaf was once a disciple of the Sword Dao sect. He studied sword techniques in the Sword Dao sect. Who would have thought that he would become a disciple of the Supreme Sword sect today? Who are you? How did you know? Withered Leaf was extremely shocked when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. In this era, there were very few people who knew that he was from the Sword Dao sect. Even many disciples of the Supreme Sword sect thought that Withered Leaf, the Supreme Elder, had always been a disciple of the Supreme Sword sect. They would never have thought that Withered Leaf was actually from the Sword Dao sect. When the 7 major sects besieged the Sword Dao sect, most of the disciples of the Sword Dao sect fought to the end. However, there were still some disciples of the Sword Dao sect who chose to side with the 7 major sects and besieged the Sword Dao sect. It seemed that Withered Leaf was one of them. After all, Donggong Li, Donggong Ju and the other disciples of the 7 major sects besieged the Sword Dao sect. Withered Leaf was even more abominable. When Withered Leaf joined the Sword Dao sect, his aptitude was not high. He only became outstanding after learning the Sword Dao sect's sword techniques. However, in the end, he turned around and helped the 7 major sects to deal with the Sword Dao sect for his own selfish reasons. Chu Fengmian hated this kind of traitor more than the people of the 7 major sections. You don't need to know who I am. Anyway, you're going to be a dead man soon. Chu Fengmian shouted coldly. The sword in his hand rotated and hundreds of sword chi were released at the same time, slashing towards Withered Leaf from all directions. Chu Fengmian wanted to kill a traitor of the Sword Dao sect first. Boundless Sword Dance. The sword in Withered Leaf's hand flashed continuously. His body was in the air as if he was performing a sword dance. However, all the sword chi that approached him were destroyed one after another. The Boundless Sword Dance was once a sword technique of the Sword Dao sect. Chapter 1730. Countless sword lights flashed in the sky. In terms of sword principle, the current Shang Sword sect was far from comparable to the Sword Principle sect. Although the Sword Principle sect's swordsmanship was created by the Sword Principle Master, it was much more mysterious than the Shang Sword Principle sect's swordsmanship. Because of this, the former Shang Sword sect joined forces with the other 6 sects to attack the Sword Principle sect for the swordsmanship of the Sword Principle sect. Withered Leaf came from the Sword Principle sect and knew many of the sect's swordsmanship. However, he did not use it in order to hide his identity. Now that Chu Fengmian had exposed his identity, he no longer had any scruples. Every move he made was the Sword Principle sect's swordsmanship. Boy, I didn't want to use the Sword Principle sect's swordsmanship. You forced me to. Withered Leaf stared at Chu Fengmian with a ferocious expression. I know that you've obtained the inheritance of the Sword Dao sect. You've also obtained countless sword arts from the Sword Dao sect. Unfortunately, your sword arts are nothing compared to mine. Destroy. Boom. The sword in Withered Leaf's hand pierced into the void. Immediately, hundreds of sword edges appeared in the void around Chu Fengmian and shot towards Chu Fengmian. Void-piercing sword. One of the Sword Principle sect's assassination swordsmanship. Sword edges pierced through the void from all directions. It was simply impossible to guard against them and they were unstoppable. Ridiculous. Withered Leaf, even after 10,000 years, your swordsmanship is only SOSO. Do you think you can kill me? Chu Fengmian looked at the Withered Leaf disdainfully as he unleashed countless swordsmanship. If the sword cultivators of the 9 regions saw Withered Leaf's swordsmanship, they would think it was very mysterious. However, in Chu Fengmian's eyes, Withered Leaf's swordsmanship was not worth mentioning. Among the countless disciples of the former Sword Principle Master, Chu Fengmian had the highest understanding of swordsmanship. Now that Chu Fengmian had reincarnated, his swordsmanship had improved further. Withered Leaf's swordsmanship was just a joke in Chu Fengmian's eyes. Break! Chu Fengmian's expression did not change. He suddenly pointed his sword forward and a sword light flashed. The countless sword edges in front of Chu Fengmian were all shattered. With a single sword strike, all of them were neutralized. Then, Chu Fengmian's body approached the withered leaf. The sword in his hand was shrouded in boundless killing intent. There was a thick smell of blood on the tip of the sword. Sword art of slaughter. Chu Fengmian had no intention of showing mercy to this traitor. His killing intent was completely concentrated on the tip of his sword. He unleashed his slaughter sword technique and slashed at the withered leaf. In an instant, the slaughter sword art turned into a blood-red sword aura and slashed at withered leaf's body. The barriers that were formed around him were mercilessly crushed. When sword cultivators fought, it was a competition of their sword techniques and comprehension of the sword Dao. In terms of sword Dao comprehension, Withered Leaf was just a child compared to Chu Fengmian. It would be easy for Chu Fengmian to kill him. The peak of the sword God realm. Your comprehension of the sword Dao has already reached the peak of the sword God realm. How is this possible? This is a level that countless true disciples of the sword Dao sect have never reached. Withered Leaf's expression changed drastically as he shouted in disbelief after his countless sword techniques were broken by Chu Fengmian in an instant. His comprehension of the sword Dao had also reached the level of the sword God realm. Among the thousands of sword cultivators, he could be considered an expert. But now, Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship was actually enough to crush him. This could only be done by someone at the peak of the sword God realm. But this level was only achieved by the master of the sword Dao and the sword Dao sect in the past. Even the other disciples of the master of the sword Dao, such as Jianwang and the others, could not achieve this. This kind of heaven-defying comprehension of the sword Dao had actually appeared in Chu Fengmian, a young man who was not even 20 years old. Who said that none of the former true disciples could reach this level? Chu Fengmian sneered when he heard Withered Leaf's words. Former true disciple? Chu Jianbai? Chu Fengmian? You're Chu Jianbai? Withered Leaf was stunned when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He suddenly thought of something and stared at Chu Fengmian in disbelief. Chu Jianbai, you're not dead? Impossible, how are you still alive? In the Sword Dao sect, other than the master of the Sword Dao, there was indeed another person who had reached this level of comprehension of the Sword Dao. That was the former Chu Jianbai. However, no matter how high Chu Jianbai's comprehension of the Sword Dao was, no one would pay attention to him because he did not have spiritual power. No matter how strong the sword technique was, it was worthless in his hands. However, Chu Fengmian in this life was completely different. He had spiritual power, condensed the divine vein, and obtained the battle dragon technique. His strength had reached an unimaginable level. In addition to his comprehension of the sword Dao at the peak of the sword God realm. On the path of the sword Dao, the current Chu Fengmian was invincible. Not bad, it seems that you also know who killed you. It can be considered as letting you die knowing. Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold when he heard Withered Leaf's words. Since you know, then prepare to die. Chu Fengmian was Chu Jianbai. Only a dead person was qualified to know. Chu Jianbai is not dead, he's actually not dead, and even has a spiritual vein. Not good, this news must be spread. We must have the old antiques in the Upper Sword sect in seclusion come and kill this child. Withered Leaf also understood when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Chu Fengmian had admitted to his words. Chu Fengmian was Chu Jianbai, the former #1 genius of the Sword Dao and the Sword Dao sect. Especially now, not only was Chu Fengmian not dead, he even had spiritual power. He was no longer the Chu Jianbai who had shocking Sword Dao but no power. This was a much greater threat than the Chu Jianbai of the past. Origin of the 8 directions. Boom! In an instant, just as Chu Fengmian's sword was about to arrive, Withered Leaf's body suddenly exploded. Bloody mist filled the sky and drifted in the air. From his body, a silver spiritual sword immediately flew out. Natal sword origin. Different from other cultivators, the foundation of a sword cultivator was the natal sword origin in their body. As long as the natal sword origin was present, even if the body was shattered, it could be recovered. Withered Leaf had actually abandoned his body and escaped with his natal sword origin. He wanted to spread the news that Chu Fengmian was Chu Jianbai. Once this news was spread, even the old antiques in the 7 great sects who were in seclusion would not hesitate to die to kill Chu Fengmian. But today, since Chu Fengmian dared to tell Withered Leaf his identity, he would not allow Withered Leaf to spread the news. Chapter 1731. Withered Leaf's natal sword energy turned into a small golden sword and suddenly flew out. Chu Fengmian's face was extremely cold when he saw this scene. He sneered and moved his mind. The shadow of a dragon appeared behind Chu Fengmian and roared loudly. Roars rang out one after another. The surrounding space was completely sealed off. Jianwang change. With the breakthrough of Chu Fengmian's strength, his control over the power of ancestor Jianwang's bloodline had become stronger. The bloodline of ancestor Jianwang was no longer independent of Chu Fengmian's bloodline, but had integrated with the Dragon Emperor's blood essence in Chu Fengmian's body. Now, the power of Chu Fengmian's Jianwang change was 10 times stronger than before the breakthrough. Even Withered Leaf, who was known as an invincible sovereign, would not be able to take a single step forward in this sealed space. No matter how much power Withered Leaf exerted, he could not break through the seal of Jianwang change. Chu Fengmian's power had reached an incredible level after he stepped into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu's realm. When he was in the 8 Tribulations Emperor Gu's realm, Chu Fengmian's strength was enough to easily kill Withered Leaf, an invincible emperor. Now that he had stepped into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu's realm, he would not have any fear even if he was facing a half-step celestial being expert. I'll use your blood to pay tribute to the Sword Principal Sect. Chu Fengmian looked at Withered Leaf and suddenly waved his hand. It turned into a huge dragon claw and grabbed at Withered Leaf. Withered Leaf almost used all his strength when he saw the dragon claw coming, but he still could not break through the seal of Jianwang change. Crack! Crack! As the dragon claw fell, the layers of defense around Withered Leaf were ruthlessly broken. In the next moment, Chu Fengmian grabbed Withered Leaf's natal sword energy in the palm of his hand. Ignoring Withered Leaf's pleas for mercy, Chu Fengmian exerted force in his palm and crushed Withered Leaf's natal sword energy in the palm of his hand. Withered Leaf's power also dissipated with the wind and integrated into the Sword Dao Gate, becoming the soil of the Sword Dao Gate. This Withered Leaf, which could be called an invincible sovereign, was easily killed by Chu Fengmian. On the other side, Chu Fengmian had no intention of letting go of Donggongli, who was being suppressed by the battle dragon's claw. He exerted force in his palm and crushed Donggongli. Chu Fengmian pointed his finger at the sky and merged into the ground of the Sword Dao Gate. Today, Chu Fengmian wanted to use the blood of these experts from the 7 great sects to pay tribute to the Sword Dao sect. Whoosh! After killing Kuyi and Donggongli, Chu Fengmian's figure flickered and left the underground. He turned into a ray of light and soared into the sky. In the Sword Dao sect, the accumulated battles were still ongoing. Although the Sword Dao sect's disciples were much stronger than when they were first established, they were still vulnerable in front of the alliance of the 7 sections. Under the siege of countless experts from the 7 great sects, many of the Sword Dao sect's disciples were forced to retreat. Moreover, many of the palaces in the Sword Dao sect had been destroyed by the disciples of the 7 great sects and their countless resources had been plundered. It could be said to be a miserable scene. Hanueli, Luoshi, Qing Meng, Emperor Yan, and the others joined forces to set up a huge array to protect the group of Sword Dao sect's disciples. However, under the continuous attacks, cracks began to appear on the great array. It seemed like it would shatter at any moment. A middle-aged man, who was holding a ray of light condensed from a galaxy, fiercely bombarded the array with a ferocious look on his face. Don't waste your energy struggling. It won't help if you continue to struggle. Ha ha, there are so many geniuses. Their blood essence will be enough to increase my strength. A black-robed old man, who was emitting a shocking demonic aura, stared at Luo Shi and said viciously, "Luo Shi, you are indeed the woman that the demon emperor once fancied. You have a noble bloodline. Today, I will capture you and enjoy you before I devour your blood essence." Luo Shi used to be the charming demon sect leader of the 6 demon sects and the woman that the demon emperor fancied. In the 6 demon sects, the demon emperor wasn't the only one who had his eyes on Luo Shi. However, he didn't dare to lay his hands on Luo Shi because of the demon emperor. However, he didn't have any scruples now. "Old man Guanzhou, you must be dreaming." Luo Shi's face turned cold when she heard the black-robed old man's words. The chaotic gate opened behind her. Countless chaotic chi condensed in Luo Shi's palm and turned into countless killing moves that blasted towards old man Guanzhou. However, there was still a difference in their cultivation levels. No matter how mysterious Luo Shi's attacks were, she was only an 8th Tribulation Emperor Gu. Compared to old man Guanzhou, who was said to be an invincible emperor, her realm was too far apart. Old man Guanzhou sneered when he saw the chaotic chi and the countless killing moves. He waved his hand and broke them all. At the same time, old man Guanzhou continued to attack. Countless demonic hands blasted on the large array formed by the crowd, causing the array to shake. Break! The other invincible sovereigns also made their moves at the same time, striking out countless martial skills one after another, bombarding the array. However, at this moment, a sword radiance suddenly descended from the sky. This sword light slashed towards everyone present at the same time. The 13 invincible emperors were all shrouded by the sword radiance. What is going on? Where did the sword radiance come from? The sudden appearance of the sword radiance was out of everyone's expectations. However, the 13 invincible emperors retreated at the same time. They gathered their spiritual energy and clashed with the sword radiance in the air. Rumble! The collision of the two forces caused the entire sword principle sect to tremble. The combined attacks of the 13 invincible emperors barely managed to fight the sword radiance to a standstill. What a powerful force! Who is it? Countless gazes suddenly lifted up and looked towards the sky. They saw a figure slowly appearing at the place where the sword radiance had struck. It's the sect master. The sect master has come out of seclusion. Countless disciples of the sword principle sect shouted in ecstasy when they saw Feng Mian's figure. They had finally seen a ray of light amidst this crisis. Last time, Chu Fengmian had killed all the experts of the 3 major sects by himself. This time, Chu Fengmian had come out of seclusion again. Moreover, the aura on Chu Fengmian's body was much stronger than before. Chapter 1732. It's a success. Han Yueli, Luo Shi, and the others looked at Chu Fengmian. Everyone felt relieved. They had fought to the end to buy time, and now it seemed that they had done it. Chu Fengmian had truly stepped into the realm of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. Judging from the change in Chu Fengmian's aura, it was clear that Chu Fengmian's strength was completely different from before. If Chu Fengmian's strength was still in the realm of the Emperor realm before, then Chu Fengmian had now surpassed the Emperor realm. In terms of true strength, he was not inferior to a real half-step celestial being realm master. The 13 invincible sovereigns were barely able to block his sword, even though they had joined forces. This was the true strength of a half-step celestial being realm master, which had surpassed the strength of an Emperor realm master. Sect master? This person is Chu Fengmian? Didn't they say that this person had just stepped into the realm of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu? How can he be so powerful? Everyone looked at Chu Fengmian in disbelief. The 13 invincible Emperor realm masters could feel Chu Fengmian's strength the moment they exchanged blows with him. Any one of them would die if they tried to resist that power alone. Even if the 13 of them joined forces, they could only barely block it. Not to mention a person who had just stepped into the realm of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu, even those old antiques who were only one step away from reaching the half-step celestial being realm could not have such strength. Aren't Kuyi and Dongongli going to kill this boy? Where are they? Suddenly, a person spoke up. Donggong Li and Ku Yi were originally going to stop Chu Fengmian from breaking through. But now, Chu Fengmian was standing here. What about the two of them? Everyone's expression changed when they heard this. Immediately, many of them activated their spiritual senses and began to detect the surrounding aura. However, the more they used their spiritual senses to detect, the more embarrassed they became. Because now, they could no longer sense the aura of Donggong Li and Ku Yi. This proved that the two of them had either died or left the Sword Dao sect. However, now that Chu Fengmian was standing there could only be one conclusion: the two of them had already died by Chu Fengmian's hands. While the crowd was discussing, Chu Fengmian's gaze swept across the 13 invincible sovereigns. Among them, there were a few familiar faces that Chu Fengmian had seen before. However, Chu Fengmian did not see anyone from the Xing family among them. Logically speaking, if the Alpha Hall had come to attack the Sword Dao sect, the Xing family would definitely be the ones leading the attack. However, the person leading the Heavenly Pivot Halls group was Emperor Zhong. It seems that Xing Bailey should have sensed something. Chu Fengmian thought to himself. However, it was better that there were no Xing family members. If Chu Fengmian wanted to kill the Xing family members, it would be difficult for him to do so. However, Chu Fengmian wouldn't hesitate to kill these people. Chu Fengmian's gaze swept across and finally landed on the black-robed old man Guanjiu. Chu Fengmian had heard this man shamelessly boasting that he wanted to capture Luo Shi just now. No one could offend Chu Fengmian's woman. Even if they imagined it, it would only lead to death. Die! Rumble! Suddenly, Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with killing intent. He waved his hand and the titanic divine sword came out of its sheath. The killing intent gathered on the blade of the sword and instantly turned into a sword radiance, slashing towards old man Guanjiu. Chu Fengmian took the initiative to attack when the 13 invincible sovereigns joined forces. His first target was old man Guanjiu. Massacre sword art. The killing intent gathered and the blood chi surged. It turned into a sword radiance and slashed towards old man Guanjiu. Old man Guanjiu felt the dense killing intent from Chu Fengmian's sword radiance and his body couldn't help but tremble. Let's attack together. Don't hold back anymore. Let's practice and kill this guy first. The other experts standing beside old man Guanjiu also felt the threat from Chu Fengmian's sword radiance. Facing Chu Fengmian now, any one of them would die if they fought him alone. Only by practicing their skills and fighting against Chu Fengmian would they have a chance of survival. There was no need for any discussion. The 13 invincible sovereigns attacked at the same time and each of them used their strongest trump cards. Under the joint efforts of the 13 people, hundreds of killing moves were launched at Chu Fengmian in an attempt to block the sword art of slaughter. However, as the sword radiance from the massacre sword art swept across, all of their attempts to block it were meaningless. The numerous killing moves that the 13 invincible sovereigns had launched were all crushed. Out of the 13 figures, many of them were sent flying by the impact of the collision. Now that Chu Fengmian had stepped into the realm of the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu, he was no different from a true half-step to celestial realm expert. He was even stronger than most half-step to celestial realm experts. Facing these invincible sovereigns, it was almost a crushing situation. With one sword radiance, the 13 invincible sovereigns were all sent flying. Die! Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold. He once again gathered spiritual energy on the sword radiance and launched a sword radiance towards old man Guanjiu. The sword radiance tore through the space and instantly slashed old man Guanjiu's body. He didn't even have a chance to react. Old ghost Guanjiu's body was struck by the sword light. In the next instant, his body was mercilessly torn apart by the power of the sword aura. Blood mist filled the sky as it scattered in the air. Soon after, it merged with the soil of the swordway gate. Old man Guanjiu had fallen. When the other invincible sovereigns saw this scene, their faces were extremely pale. Many of them couldn't believe their eyes. Just now, 13 of them had joined forces and launched their killing moves. They had unleashed their full strength, but they still couldn't resist Chu Fengmian. This kind of strength was simply invincible. It shouldn't be possible for an Emperor Realm Master to possess such strength. In an instant, many invincible sovereigns at the scene wanted to retreat. They looked at Chu Fengmian with eyes that had lost their will to fight. This kind of invincible strength made them lose the courage to confront Chu Fengmian. They didn't want to fight anymore. Chu Fengmian, I didn't expect your strength to reach such a level. It seems that I have to kill you myself. Suddenly, an old voice sounded. At the same time, a wave of spiritual energy appeared and pressed towards Chu Fengmian. Chapter 1733. No one was aware of the sudden burst of spirit qi. It was a silent attack, oppressing Chu Fengmian. As this spiritual energy descended from the sky, an extremely strong power of heaven and earth suddenly descended. In front of the world energy, even the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu seemed to be an ant. Rumble! This spiritual power seemed to have suddenly burst out from somewhere in the depths of the void. It tore through countless spaces and bombarded Chu Fengmian. The heavens and earth trembled. The space within the Sword Dao sect had been specially refined and was incomparably sturdy. However, it was still shattered by this surge of spiritual energy. This kind of power had already exceeded the scope of the Emperor Realm. A half-step Celestial Realm Master had made a move. A half-step Celestial Realm Master who belonged to the 7 great sects. Chu Fengmian had long guessed that with the heritage of the 7 great sects, it was impossible that there were no half-step Celestial Realm Masters. However, just like how many half-step Celestial Realm experts in the Holy Dragon Mystery Dimension were in closed-door training, the half-step Celestial Realm experts in the 7 major sects were also in closed-door training to comprehend the Celestial Realm. Unless it was a last resort, they would not easily make a move. After all, the lifespan of many of these masters had reached the limit. Once they made a move and were injured, they might not be able to step into the Celestial Realm again for the rest of their lives. The difficulty of stepping into the Celestial Realm was 100 times, or even 1,000 times, more difficult than stepping into the half-step Celestial Realm. In today's Daluo star field, there were at least 10 half-step Celestial Realm Masters. However, there was not a single one who was in the Celestial Realm. Even the young Emperor, who was said to be the most promising to step into the Celestial Realm, and even Yunzun, had not really stepped into the Celestial Realm. Even with the young Emperor's monstrous talent, he could not step into the Celestial Realm. He was stuck at the peak of the half-step Celestial Realm and could not go any further. It was enough to show how difficult it was to step into the Celestial Realm. In order to step into the Celestial Realm, many half-step Celestial Realm Masters went into hiding and did not intend to take any risks. This time, there was actually an expert of the half-step Celestial Realm who came to deal with Chu Fengmian. It seemed that the news of Chu Fengmian killing the experts of the 3 great sects had already spread to the 7 great sections. Therefore, this time, in order to destroy the Swordway sect, not only did they send 15 invincible sovereigns, but they also sent a half-step Celestial Being expert. However, it seemed that this half-step Celestial Being realm expert was not willing to make a move. Only when he saw that others were no match for Chu Fengmian did he choose to make a move. This time, it seemed that in order to deal with Chu Fengmian, the 7 sects had also spent a lot of money. Even the experts of the half-step Celestial Being realm had been invited out. Since this half-step Celestial Being realm expert had decided to make a move, the moment he made a move, it was an absolute killing move, bombarding toward Chu Fengmian. The moment this spiritual power was released, the power that erupted was pure brute force. This kind of brute force seemed stupid, but in fact, it was the most powerful because it was difficult to resist this spiritual power with any means. The only way to resist it was to meet force with force. The experts of the 7 great sects also knew that Chu Fengmian had many means to deal with Chu Fengmian. It was almost impossible to use them to deal with Chu Fengmian, so it was better to make a move directly and kill Chu Fengmian with a thunderous force. Ancient Halberd. The moment this spiritual power approached the top of Chu Fengmian's head, it suddenly condensed into a long halberd and suddenly slashed toward Chu Fengmian. Ancient Halberd. An expert of the Ancient Desolation sect. The moment this halberd appeared, it was clear which force this half-step celestial being realm expert belonged to. Indeed, among the 7 great sects, the ancient Desolation sect hated Chu Fengmian the most. After all, Chu Fengmian had sneaked into the Divine Tree's secret realm of the ancient Desolation sect and stolen the Divine Tree. It could be said that Chu Fengmian's current achievements were closely related to the Divine Tree. Without the Divine Tree, Chu Fengmian would have died countless times along the way. Such a treasure should have belonged to the ancient Desolation sect, but now it had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands. It was no wonder that the ancient Desolation sect hated Chu Fengmian so much. As soon as the ancient halberd appeared, the half-step celestial being realm expert of the ancient Desolation sect also appeared. He added spiritual power to the halberd and slashed at Chu Fengmian. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian with this blow. If it was before, Chu Fengmian could only retreat when faced with this half-step celestial being realm expert's sudden attack. But this time, Chu Fengmian had stepped into the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu. Even if it was a half-step celestial being realm expert, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. Chu Fengmian raised his head and looked at the descending ancient halberd. He sneered, but did not dodge. Instead, he met the blow with the sword in his hand. Boom! A shocking sword intent erupted from Chu Fengmian's sword. It soared into the sky and collided with the ancient halberd, erupting with endless power. The power of the collision was no different from a fight between 2 half-step celestial being realm experts. Once involved in this power, even if it was the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu, or even an invincible Emperor realm expert, they could be killed by the aftershock. Everyone hurriedly retreated, leaving an empty space in the Sword Dao sect. No one dared to take a step forward. Many Sword Dao sect disciples raised their heads and looked at the battle in the sky. Their eyes were filled with worry. They naturally knew that Chu Fengmian's strength was tyrannical. But this time, Chu Fengmian was no longer facing an Emperor realm expert, but a half-step celestial being realm expert. A half-step celestial being realm expert was only 1 step into the celestial being realm. It was completely different from the Emperor realm. No matter how strong Chu Fengmian was, in the face of a half-step celestial being realm expert, many people were still a little panicked. Han Yueli and Luo Shi looked at Chu Fengmian with a little nervousness. But they also knew that a battle of this level was no longer something they could intervene in. For Chu Fengmian, their intervention was just a hindrance. They could only join forces to protect the countless palaces in the Sword Dao sect from being destroyed by the aftershock. The ancient Desolate sect's secret art is indeed tyrannical. The collision was evenly matched. Chu Fengmian also clearly felt that the half-step celestial being realm expert in front of him was definitely stronger than the 5-element Saber Saint. Chapter 1734. In terms of strength. Although the half-step celestial realm expert from the barren ancient sect was not as strong as the young emperor, he was at least one of the half-step celestial realm experts. Especially this half-step celestial realm expert from the barren ancient sect. His aura was actually weaker than the 5-element Saber Saint. However, the power that erupted from him surpassed that of the 5-element Saber Saint. This was the difference in cultivation techniques. The cultivation techniques of the 7 major sects were handed down from an extremely ancient era. In that era, the 9 regions were once one of the 4 saint regions. Even the Avalon of 5 elements, where the 5-element Saber Saint came from, was one of the top forces in the Daluo star field. However, compared to the barren ancient sect, their foundation was far inferior. This kind of foundation was not much of a difference among the weaker martial artists. However, once one reached the half-step celestial realm, or even the true celestial realm, the difference would be obvious. The half-step celestial realm experts in the 9 regions were much more difficult to deal with than those in the Daluo star field. However, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. He had now stepped into the realm of the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu, and his strength had skyrocketed. Break! Chu Fengmian looked at the sky and shouted coldly. The power in the sword in his hand suddenly skyrocketed, turning into a sharp sword aura that shot up to the sky. The condensed halberd collided with the sword aura. In the next moment, it shattered, turning into waves of spiritual power and dissipating in the sky. What? A surprised voice suddenly rang out from the depths of the void. It seemed that the half-step celestial realm expert had not expected this. Chu Fengmian was able to dissolve his attack. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian with one move, but Chu Fengmian had easily blocked his attack. In the eyes of the half-step celestial realm expert, the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu was an existence that could be easily crushed. He did not expect Chu Fengmian to dissolve his attack so easily. It seems that you have obtained the inheritance of the Sword Principle sect, and even the inheritance of the old man, the master of Sword Principle. Otherwise, it would be impossible for you to have such strength. The half-step celestial realm expert's voice rang out from the void again. The power unleashed by the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu was comparable to a half-step celestial being. This kind of strength could indeed be called heaven-defying. After all, even Wu Dao, one of the most outstanding geniuses in the Holy Dragon Mystery Dimension, which was one of the four major forces in the Daluo star field, was only close to the half-step celestial being realm. After activating his secret technique, his strength was enough to crush an Emperor Realm Master, but there was still a huge gap between him and a true half-step heaven being. It was impossible for someone like Chu Fengmian, whose power was enough to be on par with someone half a step into the celestial being realm. No one in the world should be able to do that. It seems like the Sword Dao sect is still alive even after death. But it's just as well. Many of the Sword Dao sect's secrets and treasures must be in your hands. I'll capture you first and see what the Sword Dao sect is up to. As the voice spoke, it suddenly attacked again. Above Chu Fengmian's head, the space was suddenly torn apart and a long river appeared. This long river contained an incomparably ancient power. The ancient desolate river. Compared to the ancient desolate Dao, it was a more powerful secret technique. The ancient desolate Dao was able to borrow the power of the ancient desolate to fight against the enemy. Stepping into the ancient desolate was enough to avoid countless attacks. And this ancient desolate river was enough to pull a cultivator into it and suppress them with the power of the ancient desolate. In ancient times, this ancient desolate river was said to be enough to suppress people of the same realm. For example, when the ancient desolate sect's half-step celestial being realm master attacked, this move was enough to suppress the existence of the same realm. The moment the ancient desolate river condensed and appeared, Chu Fengmian felt a huge force pulling Chu Fengmian's body into it. Want to suppress me? What a joke. You alone? That's wishful thinking. Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient desolate river and laughed. Suddenly, a huge vortex appeared behind him. It was the heaven-devouring secret technique. As Chu Fengmian's strength grew, he could better control the great power contained in the innate divine beast bloodline. The moment the sky-devouring secret technique was unleashed, it kept growing above Chu Fengmian's head. The strong devouring power shrouded the ancient desolate river and drove it crazily. In this ancient desolate river, a steady stream of ancient desolate power was pulled out and absorbed into the sky-devouring secret technique, turning into Chu Fengmian's power. Although this ancient desolate river borrowed the power of the ancient desolate era, its source was still the power of the ancient desolate sect's half-step celestial being realm master. Chu Fengmian activated the sky-devouring secret technique and crazily devoured the ancient desolate power, almost devouring the power of the half-step celestial being realm master. The bloodline of the sky-devouring beast? The sky-devouring secret technique? How could you have such a thing? A shocked voice was heard from the void. The half-step celestial being realm expert was also experienced and knowledgeable. At a glance, he recognized the true origin of the deep vortex above Chu Fengmian's head. The sky-devouring beast. This was an innate divine beast that was only recorded in the ancient books of the 9 regions. In the 9 regions, there was no such thing as the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast, so no one could control this power. However, Chu Fengmian had obtained the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast by chance when he was in the ancient monster continent. Chu Fengmian did not use it when he was dealing with the martial artists of the 3 major sections. Therefore, the half-step celestial being realm master was caught off guard. However, the half-step celestial being realm master made a prompt decision. Suddenly, a large amount of spiritual power burst out from the void, as if to break the sky-devouring secret technique and stop it from devouring. However, at this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly moved. The moment the spiritual power burst out, Chu Fengmian attacked at the same time. The spiritual power condensed on the tip of the sword in his hand, and he suddenly slashed at the depths of the void. "Stop playing tricks. Come out." The sword light that Chu Fengmian shot into the void suddenly exploded, and a strong force swept through the entire void. The half-step celestial being realm master of the ancient desolate sect, who had been hiding in the depths of the void, was also swept by the sword light. Waves of spiritual energy fluctuations were emitted as a figure suddenly flew out from the void. Chapter 1735. This half-step celestial being expert of the barren ancient sect was forced out from the depths of the void by the violent sword chi. Once an expert of the half-step celestial being realm was hidden, it was not easy for Chu Fengmian to detect him. After all, even if Chu Fengmian had made a breakthrough, he was still in the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. There might not be a gap in strength between him and the half-step celestial being realm, but there was still a gap in realm. Therefore, when Chu Fengmian was fighting with this half-step celestial being realm expert, he also sent a wisp of his spiritual consciousness into the void to detect the half-step celestial being realm expert's location. It was not a good thing for Chu Fengmian to be in the open while the enemy was in the dark. Now that he had activated the sword chi and forced his figure out from the depths of the void, it was easier for Chu Fengmian to deal with him. This figure flew out from the void and revealed itself. It was a middle-aged man with a scar on his eyebrows. He looked to be in his early 30s. However, the half-step celestial being realm experts had a long lifespan, much longer than that of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. Therefore, the real age of this middle-aged man was much older than that of the withered leaf. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the real appearance of this middle-aged man, a somewhat strange smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Good skill to be able to detect my presence. It seems that your real strength is no different from that of a half-step celestial being realm expert." The middle-aged man was forced out of the void. He looked at Chu Fengmian with a slightly surprised expression. His means of concealing himself could be said to be incomparably mysterious. Even martial artists who were also half a step into the celestial realm would find it difficult to detect his presence. Let alone a Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. Now that Chu Fengmian could force him out, it meant that Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness was no less than that of a half-step celestial being realm expert. The middle-aged man looked at Chu Fengmian with a bit of surprise in his eyes. He looked at Chu Fengmian curiously. "Interesting. I didn't expect such a figure to appear in the Sword Principle sect after 10,000 years. As soon as he finished speaking, in his eyes, there was a hint of golden light. He seemed to want to see through all of Chu Fengmian's trump cards. The moment his gaze swept over them, it seemed as if no trump card or technique could escape his eyes. Gilded golden eyes. The gilded divine body was one of the innate divine bodies, and it had the special characteristics of the gilded divine body. However, the gilded divine body didn't have any fighting ability. Instead, it was bestowed with a pair of eyes that could see through everything, which was the gilded eyes. Warriors of the same realm, or even warriors of a higher realm than the owner of the golden eyes, would be seen through by this pair of eyes. All secrets would be exposed. However, when the gilded golden eyes looked at Chu Fengmian, it discovered a void. Chu Fengmian's hidden trump cards were endless. Even the gilded golden eyes couldn't see through Chu Fengmian's mysteries. Moreover, Chu Fengmian felt that Chu Fengmian also had a kind of ability to hide from prying. It seemed that since his rebirth, Chu Fengmian had become a unique existence that could shield others from prying. As long as Chu Fengmian was willing, no expert of the half-step celestial realm could see through Chu Fengmian. Having lived 2 lives, Chu Fengmian not only had the Taoist heart of 2 lives, but also had other mysteries. No matter how the middle-aged man used his gilded golden eyes to pry, he still couldn't see through any of Chu Fengmian's secrets. In the end, the middle-aged man gave up. he also knew that it was meaningless to continue prying. Unless Chu Fengmian was willing to let him see, otherwise, no matter how he tried to pry, he would return empty-handed. I didn't expect that a little Emperor Gu of the 9 Tribulations could hide from my gilded golden eyes. It seems that you have had an amazing adventure. No wonder you rose so quickly in such a short time. The middle-aged man looked at Chu Fengmian with a cold smile on his face. But it doesn't matter. I'll capture you and bring you back to the desolate ancient sect for torture. We'll still know all your secrets. The middle-aged man looked at Chu Fengmian as if he was looking at a dead man. Even if Chu Fengmian forced him to reveal himself, he still didn't take Chu Fengmian seriously. After all, with his half-step celestial realm cultivation, it wasn't easy for him to deal with a mere Emperor Gu of the 9 Tribulations. However, when the middle-aged man was about to make his move, he saw the strange smile on Chu Fengmian's face. The moment he saw the strange smile, the middle-aged man's heart was filled with anger. He shouted coldly, "Kid, what are you laughing at?" "Oh, I just didn't expect to meet you one day. Huang Lujin, I didn't expect you to be so lucky that you're still alive." Chu Fengmian looked at the middle-aged man, who was Huang Lujin, and suddenly said, "It seems that you're quite lucky. You were banished to the endless oceanic trench after sneaking into the Sword Dao sect. You actually survived. It seems that you were able to step into the half-step celestial realm because of some fortuitous encounter in the endless oceanic trench." The half-step celestial realm expert was called Huang Lujin. He had an innate divine body and was considered a genius in the desolate ancient sect. However, this person had been cultivating the art of concealment. Every day, he would steal from various major sects and steal countless treasures. Later, he would steal from Sword Dao sect. However, he was caught by Chu Fengmian's senior brother, Jianwang, and thrown into the endless trench. The endless oceanic trench was a dangerous place in the sea at the edge of the 9 regions. It was a bottomless trench that had countless dangers. Those who were thrown into it would most likely die. It was unexpected that Huang Lujin was still alive. The moment Chu Fengmian saw Huang Lujin, he recalled how he was thrown into the endless oceanic trench 10,000 years ago. He couldn't help but laugh. "Who are you? How do you know about this?" Huang Lujin's face changed drastically when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. For him, it was the greatest shame of his life. He was thrown into the endless oceanic trench and had to go through untold hardships to climb out. He would never allow anyone to know about his miserable appearance. "Huang Lujin, hand over the sword cauldron that you stole from the Sword Dao sect." Chu Fengmian looked at Huang Lujin and said calmly without answering his question, "Since you didn't attack the Sword Dao sect 10,000 years ago, hand over the sword cauldron and I won't kill you today." Chapter 1736. Hand over the sword cauldron and I won't kill you today. The moment they heard this, many of the surrounding cultivators from the 7 great sects were stunned. In the next moment, there was a burst of laughter. This kid must have lost his mind. He's too arrogant. Countless people looked at Chu Fengmian as if they were looking at a lunatic. Huang Lujin, who was in front of Chu Fengmian, was a true half-step celestial being expert. No matter how strong Chu Fengmian was and how many adventures he had, he was just Emperor Gu of the 9 Tribulations. Even in history, there had never been a 9 Tribulation ancient emperor who had killed a half-step celestial being martial artist. "Kid, it seems that you're courting death." Huang Lujin's face darkened when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He looked at Chu Fengmian with killing intent in his eyes. There were no celestial being realm experts in the world today. The half-step celestial being realm was the peak. Since Huang Lujin had stepped into the half-step celestial being realm, this was the first time Chu Fengmian had looked down on him. However, under this anger, Huang Lujin was also shocked by what Chu Fengmian had just said. He had been thrown into the depths of the endless trench because he had sneaked into the Sword Principal sect and stolen one of the sect's supreme treasures, the Sword Cauldron. Although Huang Lujin was later caught, the Sword Cauldron was secretly hidden. When he left the endless trench, he relied on the sword cauldron to successfully step into the half-step celestial being realm. Almost no one in the world knew that he had obtained the sword cauldron, not even in the ancient Desolation sect. All the disciples of the sword principle sect who knew about it had all fallen in the war 10,000 years ago. The sword cauldron was his greatest trump card and ultimate secret. Now that Chu Fengmian had pointed it out, he panicked. However, there was more killing intent in Huang Liujin's heart. The sword cauldron was one of the supreme treasures of the sword principle sect. It was very useful even for half-step celestial being realm experts. He did not want Chu Fengmian to reveal this secret. Die! Rumble! At the thought of this, Huang Liujin no longer hesitated and suddenly attacked. The ancient force in his hand condensed into an ancient halberd and slashed towards Chu Fengmian. His first move was an absolute killer move. Now that Chu Fengmian had revealed the secret of the sword cauldron, he no longer planned to suppress Chu Fengmian. Instead, he wanted to kill Chu Fengmian in one fell swoop. Only by killing Chu Fengmian could this news be completely sealed off to prevent future troubles. Shattering heaven and earth. Rumble. The power of the ancient halberd was pushed to the extreme. It was even more tyrannical than the five elements divine saber. It descended from the sky and blasted towards Chu Fengmian. Behind the desolate gilt gold, a scene appeared. It was an incomparably ancient era. In the desolate ancient era, groups of beasts were fighting for supremacy. Towering trees were tens of thousands of feet tall. Mountain ranges stacked up. It was the most ancient era. It was from this image that an endless stream of power of the ancients burst out, strengthening the halberd and killing Chu Fengmian with lightning speed. If you don't want to hand over the sword cauldron, then die. Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold. The sword cauldron was the most precious treasure of the sword principle sect. It must not fall into the hands of others. If Chu Fengmian was unwilling to hand over the desolate gilt gold, then he would kill him and take back the sword cauldron. Sword out. Search. From Chu Fengmian's back, the world's edge sword box suddenly opened. Sword chi flew out and surrounded Chu Fengmian. It began to condense and turned into a sword chi that was 10,000 feet long. It soared into the sky. It suddenly collided with the power of the ancient halberd. The power that erupted from this confrontation was countless times more tyrannical than the power that erupted from the previous confrontation. For a moment, the earth shook and the mountains shook. After all, the last time they fought, there was still a hint of probing. But this time, both sides used absolute killer moves. They did not hold back in the slightest. They just wanted to kill each other. Whether it was the cultivators from the Sword Dao sect or the seven great sects, they could only use their spiritual power to protect their bodies from being affected by the aftershock. Even if the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu came into contact with this kind of aftermath, he would be ruthlessly bombarded to death. The tyrannical power was enough to shatter one's blood essence, leaving no chance to reconstruct one's body. An Emperor Realm cultivator could not intervene in a fight between half-step celestial realm masters. In an instant, the huge sword chi and the ancient halberd had already collided countless times. Every time they collided, an extremely tyrannical power would erupt. For a moment, it was even harder to determine the winner. What tyrannical power? This little brat can actually fight with Huang Gilt Gold. This person has just stepped into the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, but his power is definitely at the level of half-step celestial realm. It's too terrifying. This person is just a Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, but he has such terrifying power. Once he steps into the half-step celestial realm, won't he be invincible? No, this person has to be killed. Countless cultivators of the seven great sects looked at the confrontation in the sky with different thoughts in their minds. Some were shocked, some were surprised, and some were full of murderous intent. Each had their own ulterior motives. However, none of them made a move. Instead, they quietly observed the situation. At this time, if anyone made a move and intervened rashly, they might be treated as cannon fodder and directly die in the aftermath of the two's battle. Even if they were to make a move, they would wait until Chu Fengmian and Huang Guiltgold fought to the point where both sides were injured. Then, they would suddenly make a move and take advantage of the situation to add insult to injury. In the historical records, there was indeed no record of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu killing a half-step Celestial Realm Master head-on. However, there were many stories of half-step Celestial Realm Masters dying in the hands of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. Once caught in a crisis, there was a great possibility that one could take advantage of the situation to kill a half-step Celestial Realm Master. Chu Fengmian had a great opportunity. Being able to possess such terrifying power at the level of 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu, Chu Fengmian's fortuitous encounter was self-evident. Whoever could kill Chu Fengmian and obtain Chu Fengmian's fortuitous encounter would reach the sky in a single bound. As long as Chu Fengmian showed a flaw and fell into a disadvantageous position, they would strike at lightning speed to kill Chu Fengmian and divide the benefits. However, at that moment, they were all watching quietly, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Chapter 1737. Huang Lujin is even more powerful than the 5-element Saber Saint. On the other side, Chu Fengmian also felt Huang Lujin's strength in these exchanges. Huang Lujin was indeed much more powerful than the 5-element Saber Saint whom Chu Fengmian had fought before. However, when Chu Fengmian fought with the 5-element Saber Saint last time, he only managed to escape from the 5-element Saber Saint. At that time, Chu Fengmian did not have the ability to fight with the 5-element Saber Saint, who was a half-step celestial being. However, this time, Chu Fengmian was able to fight with Huang Lujin, who was even more powerful than the 5-element Saber Saint. Chu Fengmian could no longer feel the enormous pressure. This time, Chu Fengmian changed after he stepped into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. After stepping into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu, Chu Fengmian's true strength had reached the level of a half-step celestial being. This time, Chu Fengmian was fighting with a half-step celestial being expert. He felt that it was a confrontation of strength, unlike the previous time when he felt like a mayfly trying to shake a tree. Chu Fengmian even felt that he could even suppress Huang Lujin if he went all out. After all, Chu Fengmian was just using the World Edge Sword case to fight with Huang Lujin. Chu Fengmian still had more powerful means that he had not used yet. However, Chu Fengmian was not in a hurry. He had just made a breakthrough and stepped into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. He was not so proficient in controlling his strength. Huang Lujin was also the first half-step celestial being expert that Chu Fengmian had fought head-on. Chu Fengmian wanted to use him to practice the battle between half-step celestial beings. Chu Fengmian did not fall into a disadvantageous position with each move, but he did not counterattack. He was in a stalemate, gradually familiarizing himself with his current strength. This scene was also seen by Huang Lujin. This kid is using me to practice his strength? Huang Lujin was also a figure who had lived for tens of thousands of years. He was even a genius in the desolate ancient sect 10,000 years ago. Of course, he could see Chu Fengmian's intention at a glance. This made his eyes become colder. This action showed that Chu did not take him seriously at all. Die, bastard! Boom! Suddenly, Huang Lujin's aura changed abruptly. A murderous aura suddenly appeared on his body. Killing chi erupted from Huang Lujin's body. Suddenly, he became a god of killing between heaven and earth. Lujin's Lujin was more than 10 times. Huang Lujin was more than 10 times. Kill, kill, kill! Boom! The murderous aura gathered on the ancient halberd. Suddenly, it descended, causing the entire world to crumble. The tyrannical energy shrouded Chu Fengmian's body. Inside Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 blood and flesh crystals involuntarily gathered together, forming a perfect defense. Huang Lujin of kill, Lujin's gene was kill was king kill killed Jin's. Kill of kill 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 killing art. Kill kill. Yujin to be killed kill to kill kill Lujin was used of God was God new God. The Azura was once a famous cultivator of the 9 regions. He was the creator of the sword technique of slaughter. As for the god of slaughter, he was not a sword cultivator. Instead, he was an expert in the use of countless weapons. In his hands, he had slaughtered countless lives. The killing god used the sword to create the killing sword technique. And what the exterminating god had created with his halberd was none other than this solemn halberd art. In these 10,000 years, Huang Jiujin indeed had a fortuitous encounter and actually mastered this move. Among the thousands of halberd arts, the austere halberd art was one of the most powerful ones. Especially now, Huang Liujin's heart was filled with endless killing intent towards Chufeng. This made the power of his desolate halberd technique even more tyrannical. Since it's a god-slaying method, let's give it a try. Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably cold. While he was observing Huang Liujin's attack, Chu Fengmian also made his move at the same time. Both of his swords were drawn out at the same time. Surging killing intent condensed on the two spiritual swords. Slaughter! Boom! The two spiritual swords slashed out at the same time. They turned into two blood-red sword lights and suddenly collided with the ancient halberd falling from the sky. A confrontation of killing intent. A collision of the god of slaughter technique. If some of the weaker martial artists encountered this surging killing intent, they would be eroded by the killing intent and turn into a monster that only knew how to kill. The power of the god of slaughter technique was incomparably tyrannical. Although both the killing sword technique and the desolate halberd art were heaven-level martial techniques. But in terms of true power, they were not inferior to the immortal techniques. However, only those with a strong Dao heart were qualified to control them. If one's Dao heart was not stable, the killing intent might backfire and turn into a monster that only knew how to kill. These two killing intents clashed in the air. No one was at a disadvantage. The group of martial artists from the 7 major sects originally thought that the outcome was already decided when they saw Huang Liujin's move. After all, Huang Liujin must have been forced to use such a killing move. It was already more than enough to deal with a 9 tribulations Emperor Gu. But unexpectedly, Chu Fengmian was still on par with him and did not show any signs of weakness. The sect master is so strong. Among the people from the Sword Dao sect, the Sword Slayer King looked at the scene in the air and muttered to himself. He was also a sword cultivator, but he could only look up to Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship. He was afraid that he would not be able to display such a powerful swordsmanship even if he was given a lifetime. A half-step celestial realm expert. This was an existence that was considered a big shot in countless ancient books. But Chu Fengmian was able to contend with him. Brother Chu's strength is not limited to this. Hearing the Sword Slayer King's words, Emperor Yan chuckled. He knew Chu Fengmian's strength better than the Sword Slayer King. At least, what Chu Fengmian was showing now was far from his true strength. What? Hearing Emperor Yan's words, many people from the Sword Dao sect were shocked. Although they knew that Chu Fengmian was strong, the strength that Chu Fengmian showed now was beyond their imagination. But now, this was not Chu Fengmian's full strength. All eyes were focused on the battle between Chu Fengmian and Huang Liujin in the sky. Even this is not enough to kill you? In the sky, they saw that Chu Fengmian was able to neutralize the killing halberd technique. Huang Liujin's face finally changed and became extremely solemn. He finally realized that he had underestimated Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was definitely someone who was on equal footing with him. He was not the little guy that he could trample on at will like he had imagined. Chapter 1738. With Huang Liujin's current strength, it was almost impossible for him to kill Chu Fengmian. Unfortunately, it was already too late for Huang Liujin to discover this. Just as Huang Liujin was about to retreat and think of a countermeasure to deal with Chu Fengmian's sword sharpened. The sword in Chu Fengmian's hand suddenly became much sharper. The power of the stars condensed on the sword in Chu Fengmian's left hand, turning into a sword light, and immediately slashed out. The moment the sword light slashed out, it turned into a river of stars that rolled out with the power to crush the heavens. The river of stars and the slaughter sword technique turned into a sword light that was tens of thousands of feet long. The two powers were originally completely different. However, under Chu Fengmian's extreme control over the way of the sword, he forcibly broke through the laws and condensed them together. They turned into an incomparably tyrannical sword light and blasted out. The new sword light condensed by these two forces was much more tyrannical than the sword light produced by the slaughter sword technique. When it collided with the solemn halberd technique, the solemn halberd technique was shattered in the sky. Rumble. Huang Lujin only felt an incomparably tyrannical force sweeping over. In the next moment, the ancient halberd in his hand was also shattered. The rebounding force caused his body to tremble in the air. His blood qi went berserk, and his entire body was forced to retreat continuously, forcibly retreating. A trace of blood was clearly visible on the corner of Huang Lujin's mouth. The stalemate in the sky was suddenly broken. What? Huang Lujin was forced to retreat. How is this possible? How did this guy's strength suddenly soar to such a level? Could it be that he didn't use his full strength just now? This sudden change was so sudden that many of the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu present could not react in time. The various Emperor Gu of the 7 sects were originally watching the battle between Chu Fengmian and Huang Lujin. Everyone was waiting for Chu Fengmian and Huang Lujin to be injured so that they could take the opportunity to reap some benefits. But now, Huang Lujin was actually forced back just like that. The trace of blood that appeared in his mouth meant that he was injured. This caused countless people to turn pale with fright. It was as if they had never dreamed of such a scene. Although it was an insignificant injury that Huang Lujin could recover from in an instant, it still meant that Chu Fengmian had the upper hand in this confrontation. This was a battle between the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu and a half-step celestial being. The fact that Chu Fengmian was able to contend with Huang Jiujin was already inconceivable in the eyes of countless people. This was a miraculous battle that was enough to be recorded in the ancient books. But now, Chu Fengmian had switched from defense to offense, suddenly taking the upper hand. After forcing Huang Lujin to retreat, Chu Fengmian had no intention of letting him go. Countless strands of sword qi immediately chased after Huang Lujin. Now that Huang Lujin knew Chu Fengmian's strength, there would definitely be more half-celestial being experts from the 7 sects to deal with Chu Fengmian in the future. Today, Chu Fengmian already had the intention to kill. Today, he would start with Huang Lujin. Although the 7 sects had ruled the 9 regions for tens of thousands of years and had a very deep foundation, there were not many half-celestial being experts among them. It was not easy to enter the half-celestial being realm. It was extremely difficult for one person to enter the half-celestial being realm among tens of thousands of geniuses. Aptitude and opportunity were indispensable. For example, Huang Lujin was a well-known genius in the barren ancient sect tens of thousands of years ago. But at that time, there was almost no chance for him to enter the half-celestial being realm. In the end, he took the risk to sneak into the Sword Principle sect and stole one of the sect's treasures, the Sword Cauldron. With the power of the Sword Cauldron, he entered the half-celestial being realm. Such a great opportunity was rare even in the 9 regions. Killing Huang Lujin was enough to make the barren ancient sect extremely painful. The 7 sects had dealt with Chu Fengmian time and time again. This time, Chu Fengmian would make them pay the price. Moreover, the sword cauldron on Huang Lujin's body was also something that Chu Fengmian must obtain. Of course, he would not let him go today. Damn it, little bastard. You forced me to do this. How dare you hurt me? You're just an ant. How dare you hurt me? Huang Lujin, who was forced to retreat, almost went crazy when he heard the discussions around him. He was a half-celestial being realm expert. How could he tolerate being forced to retreat by a puny 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu? Boundless killing intent erupted from Huang Lujin's body. With a roar, the shadow of a bronze cauldron slowly appeared behind him. On the bronze cauldron, there were pictures recorded. It seemed to be pictures of people practicing swordsmanship in ancient times. The Sword Principle Creation Picture. The pictures recorded were the pictures of people practicing swordsmanship when the Sword Principle was first born in the world. The bronze cauldron was the Sword Cauldron, one of the supreme treasures of the Sword Principle sect. It was an item that suppressed the sword principle sex luck and recorded the origin of the sword principle. It was a supreme treasure that was not inferior to the sword principle totem. The sword cauldron contained an incredible tyrannical power. Huang Lujin could even use the power of the sword cauldron to enter the half-celestial being realm. This kind of magical power could not be achieved by the sword principle totem. As soon as the sword cauldron shadow appeared, Huang Lujin's aura became much stronger and a murderous aura filled the air. The sword cauldron was Huang Lujin's greatest trump card. He would not use it unless it was a last resort. Today, under the pressure of Chu Fengmian, he could only display the power of the sword cauldron. However, the sword cauldron that appeared behind Huang Lujin was a phantom. Chu Fengmian looked at the real sword cauldron and saw that it was already in Huang Lujin's body. The real sword cauldron had already merged with Huang Lujin's body. He actually merged the sword cauldron into his body. No wonder he used the power of the sword cauldron to enter the half-celestial being realm. Chu Fengmian instantly understood. After all, Huang Lujin was not a swordsman. He could not understand the mystery of the sword cauldron even if he obtained it. Therefore, Huang Lujin integrated the sword cauldron into his body and used the power of the sword cauldron to enter the half-celestial being realm. The sword cauldron was an item that had once suppressed the fortune of the sword principle sect. When it was integrated into Huang Lujin's body, it was enough to bring great benefits. Just like the divine tree in Chu Fengmian's body. Chapter 1739. Boy, this is my biggest secret. Since you know about it, you will die today. No one can know about this secret. Huang Lujin stared at Chu Fengmian with murderous eyes. As he spoke, Huang Lujin's body moved. Now, he had no scruples and burst out with his full strength. The power of the sword cauldron was fully activated by Huang Lujin. The sword cauldron integrated into Huang Lujin's body and became a part of his power. The power of the ancients condensed into the ancient halberd in Huang Lujin's palm. This time around, the power of the ancient halberd was much stronger than the previous one. After the condensation, it mercilessly bombarded Chu Fengmian. It was the same ancient halberd and the same desolate halberd technique, but this time, the power was many times stronger than before. The sword chi in the sky was directly shattered. The desolate halberd technique, with boundless killing intent, slashed toward Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian's eyes were cold. Seeing the approaching halberd technique, he did not flinch and stepped forward. On the sword in Chu Fengmian's palm, a gust of wind spiritual power began to condense, causing the sword chi in the world-edge sword box to fly over. Immediately, the sword chi condensed on the sword in Chu Fengmian's palm and suddenly slashed out. 4 directions hurricane sword. The sword chi hurricane swept out. Dozens of sword chi hurricanes condensed into one and collided with the halberd technique in the sky. The two forces collided thousands of times in the sky in an instant. Useless boy, the power of the sword cauldron is far beyond your imagination. Destroy it. Huang Lujin sneered when he saw the deadlock in the sky. From his body, an even stronger power burst out and supported the ancient halberd. In an instant, Chu Fengmian felt that the power of Huang Lujin seemed to have reached an endless level. It was almost similar to the divine pulse in Chu Fengmian's body. However, Chu Fengmian knew that this power was not Huang Lujin, but the power of the sword cauldron. The sword cauldron was able to communicate with the power of the earth vein. It was almost the same as the divine vein. It was able to absorb spiritual energy and replenish its strength. However, it was an external object after all. It was slightly inferior to the divine vein. However, just based on this point alone, Huang Gilt Gold was enough to stand at the peak of countless half-step celestial tier elites. Huang Gilt Gold was like a cockroach that could not be killed. Fighting with him would only result in him being tortured to death. However, this was only true for other martial artists. For Chu Fengmian, who possessed the divine pulse, this was simply not enough. Chu Fengmian activated the power of his divine pulse to the extreme and poured a large amount of spiritual energy into the sword. The power unleashed by the Four Directions Hurricane Sword was also countless times stronger than before. It did not show any signs of weakness. This is really too terrifying. Countless gazes were fixed on the battle in the sky. In this confrontation in the air, the strength of both sides was getting stronger and stronger, but there was still no clear victor. "Brat, what do you have on you? Divine Tree?" "No, even the Divine Tree does not have such power." "Do you have an opportunity that is even more powerful than the Divine Tree?" Huang Guildgold suddenly noticed that Chu Fengmian's body was filled with almost endless spiritual energy and said in disbelief. His power was endless because he relied on the sword cauldron, but Chu Fengmian could do the same. He knew that Chu Fengmian had the divine tree that the barren ancient sect had painstakingly cultivated. However, even the divine tree could not have such an ability. This meant that Chu Fengmian had a greater hidden opportunity than the sword cauldron. The sword cauldron was enough to make Huang Guildgold from the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu to a half-step celestial tier elite in one fell swoop. If Chu Fengmian had a supreme treasure opportunity that surpassed the sword cauldron, then wouldn't he be even stronger after obtaining it? Thinking of this, Huang Guildgold's eyes became more and more greedy. He knew that riches and honor came from danger. If he had not taken a great risk to enter the Sword Principle sect and steal the sword cauldron, he would not have achieved what he had today. "Go to hell!" Huang Guildgold roared. The moment he said the word die, a huge bronze cauldron suddenly appeared in his palm. It was the sword cauldron. The sword cauldron was originally in Huang Guildgold's body, but he had taken it out and was suppressing Chu Fengmian. The sword cauldron was enough to suppress the destiny of the Sword Principle sect. It was easy to use it to suppress warriors. Treasures like the Divine Nine-Dragon Cauldron and the archaic Bronze Gate were far inferior to the Sword Cauldron in terms of array formations. Huang Guildgold also went all out. He did not intend to be in a deadlock with Chu Fengmian, so he took out the Sword Cauldron to suppress Chu Fengmian. The moment the Sword Cauldron enveloped Chu Fengmian, he felt as if his thoughts were about to come to a standstill and his spiritual energy could not be activated. Under the suppression of the Sword Cauldron, Chu Fengmian's power did not even have the ability to resist. However, the moment the sword cauldron suppressed him, Chu Fengmian's eyes revealed a hint of a smile. The moment the sword cauldron suppressed him, an ancient earthen jar suddenly appeared. An ancient earthen jar floated above Chu Fengmian's head and suddenly flew over to the sword cauldron. A dazzling light burst out from within. Amidst this light, an ancient power that surpassed the primordial era descended. The ancient human emperor enlightens all living beings. The Emperor Jar. The Emperor Jar had already fused with 7 fragments. When Chu Fengmian had stepped into the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, the Emperor Jar had quietly condensed. The 7th fragment of the Emperor Jar had also been integrated into the Emperor Jar. The Emperor Jar had been broken and divided into 9 fragments. Now, 7 of them had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands and condensed together. The 7 fragments of the Emperor Jar had transformed into the Emperor Jar, which was enough to erupt with a portion of the power of the Emperor Jar. The power of the human emperor erupted and swept through everything. Chu Fengmian felt that the feeling of oppression on his body had been swept away by the power of the human emperor. Even the sword cauldron could not compete with the Emperor Jar. When the sword cauldron was at its peak, it was a spiritual weapon that was infinitely close to an extreme immortal weapon. Its power was incomparably tyrannical. However, Huang Guildgold was not a disciple of the Sword Dao sect after all. He was not even a sword cultivator. It was not easy to control 30% of the power of the sword cauldron. Of course, it could not compete with the power of the human emperor. The suppressing power of the sword cauldron was completely shattered by the power of the Emperor Jar. Of course, Chu Fengmian had taken out the Emperor Jar not only to resist the suppression of the sword cauldron. Chapter 1740. The sword cauldron had been obtained by Huang Lujing for tens of thousands of years and had already merged with his flesh and blood. Even though Chu Fengmian was the disciple of the master of sword principle, it would be difficult for him to snatch the sword cauldron from Huang Lujing. Since Huang Lujin had merged with the Sword Cauldron, it would be extremely difficult for Chu Fengmian to kill him. Therefore, Chu Fengmian had to wait for an opportunity to temporarily separate the Sword Cauldron from Huang Lujin. Chu Fengmian could see that the Sword Cauldron had yet to recognize a master. After all, the Sword Cauldron was a spiritual weapon created by the Master of Sword Principle himself. Only the disciples of the Sword Principle sect were qualified to be recognized by it. No matter what, Huang Lujin could not make the Sword Cauldron recognize him as its master. Huang Lujin had spent countless means to make the Sword Cauldron merge with his body. As long as the Sword Cauldron and Huang Lujin were separated, Chu Fengmian would have a chance to seize the Sword Cauldron. Therefore, Chu Fengmian did not show any weakness and made Huang Lujin anxious. Finally, Huang Lujin could not help but take out the Sword Cauldron to suppress Chu Fengmian. This was what Chu Fengmian had been waiting for. The Sword Cauldron's suppressive power was extremely terrifying, but Chu Fengmian had the Emperor Jar and could easily resolve it. The power of the Emperor burst out. Not only did it disperse the suppressive power of the Sword Cauldron, but it also temporarily made Huang Lujin unable to control the Sword Cauldron. The Sword Cauldron is mine. Chu Fengmian took a step forward and suddenly came in front of the Sword Cauldron and grabbed it. The power of the Sword Cauldron was now suppressed by the Emperor Jar, so Chu Fengmian had a chance to get close. In Chu Fengmian's palm, a sword essence condensed into a small golden sword and shot into the Sword Cauldron. Extreme Sword Seal. It was the mark of the Master of Sword Principle. After all, the Sword Cauldron was a spiritual weapon created by the Master of Sword Principle. The moment the Extreme Sword Seal entered it, it suddenly shook violently, as if there was an internal struggle. The Sword Cauldron and Huang Lujin's power had merged into one in 10,000 years. Now that he felt the Extreme Sword Cauldron, it was as if the Sword Cauldron that had suddenly awakened and struggled to break free from its connection with Huang Lujin. Chu Fengmian's spiritual energy was injected into the sword tripod to help the sword tripod cut off its connection with the barren gilt gold. With the infusion of Chu Fengmian's spiritual power, the Sword Cauldron cut off its connection with the barren gilt gold and became completely independent. Ah! Huang Lujin let out a miserable shriek. He also felt that the Sword Cauldron had been completely separated from his body. It had taken him 10,000 years to become one with the Sword Cauldron. Now, Chu Fengmian had taken the Sword Cauldron from his body and cut off all connections. 10,000 years of hard work had gone down the drain. Not only that, but the moment the Sword Cauldron was taken away, the Golden Barren Body's cultivation base power started to drain rapidly. Huang Lujin was able to step into the half-step celestial realm by relying on the power of the Sword Cauldron. Now that the Sword Cauldron had been taken away, Huang Lujin's power was flowing away rapidly. He had already begun to degenerate from the half-step celestial being realm to the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. In the eyes of the crowd, all this was simply frightening. Many people did not understand what had happened in the battle in the air. After all, the battle between Chu Fengmian and Huang Lujin was beyond the scope of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. For these Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, they could not see the mystery. It was not easy to see one or two of it. But now, they could clearly see the fall of Huang Lujin's cultivation base. An expert who was half a step away from the celestial being realm actually dropped his realm during the battle with Chu Fengmian. This was really too shocking. When Huang Lujin was in the half-step celestial being realm, he was not Chu Fengmian's opponent. Now that Huang Lujin's cultivation base had fallen to the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, he was far from being Chu Fengmian's opponent. Chu Fengmian casually clapped his hands, and Huang Lujin was suppressed under Chu Fengmian's palm. No matter how he resisted, he could not escape Chu Fengmian's suppression. In the end, Huang Lujin could not even make a sound. Huang Lujin was suppressed alive. How is this possible? A half-step celestial being realm expert was suppressed by the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu? This is already outside of the rules. It's impossible. Countless Emperor Gu of the 7 major sects were stunned when they saw this scene. They could not believe the scene in front of them. Huang Lujin was suppressed by Chu Fengmian just like that. he was unable to break free from Chu Fengmian's palm. Countless Emperor Gu of the 7 major sects felt a chill in their hearts. If Wang Lujin was suppressed, what about them? How could they compete with Chu Fengmian? Run! No one knew who shouted first. All the Emperor Gu of the 7 major sects fled in all directions, trying to escape. Countless streaks of light scattered and fled in all directions, each of them using their trump cards in an attempt to escape. Want to escape? None of you can escape. Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold as he glanced at the fleeing Emperor Gu of the 7 major sections. He took a step forward and waved his hand. Chu Fengmian's palm covered the sky and the sun, enveloping the entire Sword Dao sect. The power of ancestor Jianwang erupted from Chu Fengmian's body. Rumble! The space was sealed. No matter how powerful one was, one would not be able to escape from the spatial seal. All the Emperor Gu of the 7 major sects fled in all directions in the Sword Dao sect like a group of headless flies. However, not a single person was able to escape from it. Kill! Han Yueli roared. She also knew that it was time to counterattack. Countless disciples of the Sword Dao sect had boundless killing intent in their eyes as they charged toward the disciples of the 7 major sections. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed. Suddenly, he transformed into hundreds of clones and flew in all directions. Even if it was just an incarnation, the power it possessed now was not inferior to the power it possessed before the breakthrough. Dealing with these Emperor Gu was a piece of cake. Boom! One of Chu Fengmian's clones blasted out a palm, instantly killing one of the 9 tribulations Emperor Gu. No matter how the disciples of the 7 major sects begged for mercy, Chu Fengmian's figure did not stop at all. He mercilessly killed them. These disciples of the 7 major sects rushed into the Sword Dao sect, burning, killing, and looting like bandits. None of them were innocent. Chu Fengmian naturally left no one alive. The thick smell of blood wafted in the Sword Dao sect. The blood essence of every disciple of the 7 major sects that was killed would be absorbed by the land, mountains, and rivers of the Sword Dao sect. Emperor Gu's blood essence was purer than the spiritual energy contained in a heaven-level elixir. Every inch of the land in the Sword Dao sect had absorbed the blood essence of the disciples of the 7 major sects and contained incredible power. Chapter 1741. All of this was naturally Chu Fengmian's doing. Emperor Gu's blood essence contained incomparably pure spiritual energy. If Emperor Gu's blood essence was used to irrigate trees, the trees would transform into spiritual trees. The fruits that grew from them would also be spiritual herbs. After absorbing Emperor Gu's blood essence, the land within the Sword Dao sect would become incomparably fertile and countless spiritual herbs would grow from it. However, what Chu Fengmian wanted to change this time wasn't an inch of land or a stretch of mountains and rivers. He wanted to reshape every inch of land and every mountain and river within the Sword Dao sect with Emperor Gu's blood essence. The Sword Dao sect was Chu Fengmian's lair and headquarters. Although it could be considered a small sacred ground, it was still far from being comparable to the sacred grounds of the major sections. Not to mention the sacred grounds of the 7 major sections. Even the sacred grounds of the Daluo Starfield's sacred dragon secret realm were much better than the Sword Dao sect. The spiritual energy there was much richer and the defense was tyrannical. Even a half-step celestial being would find it difficult to break through. The current Sword Dao sect was still far from that. Although Jianling had condensed the Sword Dao sect before, he didn't have much time left at that time. Moreover, Jianling didn't have as many resources as Chu Fengmian. In particular, there was so much Emperor Gu's blood essence. Even if Chu Fengmian went out to hunt now, it would take a lot of time. However, the 7 major sects had delivered themselves to his doorstep this time. There were a total of 40 Emperor Gus and hundreds of Emperor Gu's blood essence. Chu Fengmian wanted to integrate their blood essence into the Sword Dao sect. As the blood essence of Emperor Gu fused into the Sword Dao sect, the mountains and rivers within the Sword Dao sect took on a crystal-clear color. The land within had turned into a 5-colored soil. It was rumored that a true sacred region was filled with 5-colored soil. The spiritual herbs that grew from it were much more effective than those that grew from ordinary soil. According to the ancient records, the sacred grounds of the major sects in the 9 regions were also filled with 5-colored soil. Of course, there was no lack of it in the 7 major sects now. However, what Chu Fengmian wanted to do now was to transform the entire land of the Sword Dao sect into 5-colored soil. 5 colors slowly appeared from the ground, and a pure spiritual energy was emitted from it. This 5-colored soil would also give birth to pure spiritual qi. Not only would it be of great use to spiritual medicine, but it would also be of great use to a martial artist's cultivation. For Emperor Realm cultivators, world energy wasn't of much use to them. However, there were very few Emperor Realm masters in the Sword Dao sect. Most of the disciples were still life and death realm cultivators. Once the spirit qi became rich, their cultivation speed in the Sword Dao sect would be much faster, and it would be much easier for them to break through. The 7 major sects had been able to dominate the 9 regions for tens of thousands of years because the disciples of the 7 major sects had always cultivated the fastest in the 9 regions. This was because the spirit qi in the holy land of the 7 major sects was extremely pure. Now, Chu Fengmian also wanted to make the spiritual energy in the Sword Dao sect even denser. Once he succeeded, the future disciples of the Sword Dao sect would cultivate much faster. In the future, the Sword Dao sect would have a chance to become the 8th major sect, or even surpass the current 7 major sects. Of course, this was still too far away. The heritage of the 7 major sects wasn't something that Chu Fengmian alone could match. However, this time, the 7 major sects had joined forces to besiege the Sword Dao sect. It was indeed a great gift. So much Emperor Gu's blood essence wasn't easy to obtain. Of course, Chu Fengmian wouldn't waste it. Not only Emperor Gu's blood essence, but also a large number of treasures and saint medicines that Chu Fengmian obtained from various treasure vaults in the Origin Ruins Heaven. These treasures and saint medicines were of no use to Chu Fengmian, but they were of great use to many life and death realm cultivators. With a thought from Chu Fengmian, these treasures and saint medicines suddenly shattered in the air, turning into pure spiritual energy and merging into the ground. It made the 5 colors on the ground even brighter. At the same time, the spiritual energy contained in it became even purer, creating a sacred ground. Once it's created, the Sword Dao sect's defensive ability will be dozens of times stronger than it is now. Han Yueli exclaimed when he saw Chu Fengmian's method. Inside the Sword Dao sect, all the disciples of the 7 major sects had been killed. Not a single one was left alive. Countless Sword Dao sect disciples were looking at Chu Fengmian, watching him use such a heaven-defying method to create a sacred ground. The greater the power contained in the Sword Dao Gate, the greater the power of the Sword Dao Gate's mountain protection formation and countless sword formations would become. This was only relative to the Sword Dao Gate. It was like a statue. If one wanted to carve a huge statue, the wood needed to be big enough. Chu Fengmian wanted to develop the Sword Dao sect for a long time, and even develop it to the scale of the Sword Dao sect under the rule of the Sword Dao sect 10,000 years ago. Creating a sacred ground was something that had to be done. Originally, Chu Fengmian still needed to accumulate a large amount of resources to achieve this, but now, he had enough. The land of the entire Sword Dao sect was constantly changing, turning into 5-colored soil. The water in each of the rivers was changing. The water in these rivers contained extremely pure spiritual energy. It was enough to make the spiritual herbs grow faster when used to irrigate them. For some low-level warriors, this kind of water was enough to assist their cultivation. It was comparable to a spiritual elixir. Now, the Sword Dao sect was full of pure spiritual energy. This feeling was not inferior to that of many sacred grounds that had been passed down for thousands of years. Moreover, many of those sacred grounds were not large. After all, the amount of resources needed to create a sacred ground was astronomical. For example, the Sacred Dragon's secret territory was different from the sacred ground. Only those who had become saints were qualified to enter the sacred ground. But now, Chu Fengmian had transformed the entire Sword Dao sect into a sacred ground. In the future, all the disciples of the Sword Dao sect would be able to cultivate in the sacred ground. The creation is almost complete. It took him a full hour to do so. The blood essence that was floating in the Sword Dao sect had mostly disappeared. Almost all of it had been absorbed by the mountains, rivers, and earth of the Sword Dao sect. The transformation of the entire Sword Dao sect had come to an end. It no longer had the ability to transform again. If he wanted to transform again, he would need a huge amount of resources in order to continue. But for Chu Fengmian, this was enough. Chapter 1742. Under the scorching sun, there were countless mountains and rivers flowing through them. Palaces were built in the mountains. The mountains and rivers in the Sword Dao Gate looked exactly the same as before. However, if one looked closely, they would find that every inch of the mountains and rivers had changed. The appearance had not changed, but the essence had changed. The ground had turned into five-colored soil, and the water in the rivers contained extremely pure spiritual energy. Under the mountains, there was even a large amount of spiritual energy that had begun to condense. The spiritual energy under the mountains would continue to condense. After thousands of years, it might even become a dragon vein. Every breath he took was filled with pure spiritual energy. Now, the spiritual energy in the Sword Dao sect was dozens of times purer than before the transformation. Even though the 9 zones had undergone drastic changes and the spirit chi in the entire 9 zones had become incomparably dense. If the disciples of the Sword Dao sect cultivated in the Sword Dao sect, they would be 10 times faster than outside. In a short period of time, there might not be many changes. However, as time passed, the disciples of the Sword Dao sect would naturally be faster than the warriors of the 9 regions in terms of cultivation speed. All of these transformations caused earth-shattering changes in the Sword Dao sect. The power of one person to create such a sacred place. This kind of work, Emperor Yan looked at the reconstructed Sword Dao sect and sighed in his heart. He was also the lord of a continent and could be considered the sect master of a force. Naturally, he knew how difficult it was to create a sacred place. In the Yanzhou continent where Emperor Yan was from, there was also a sacred place that he had created. However, that sacred place was only 1,000 square meters in size and could only allow a dozen disciples to cultivate in it. It was far from comparable to the vast Sword Dao sect now. Moreover, when it came to the purity of spirit chi, the holy land created by the Yan Emperor was far inferior to the spirit chi in the Sword Dao sect. In the future, the Sword Dao sect will no longer be defenseless. Han Yueli and Luo Xu were overjoyed when they saw the changes in the Sword Dao sect. The two of them also treated Sword Dao sect as their home. After all, Han Yueli's cold snow pavilion had already integrated into Sword Dao sect and became a part of it. As for Luo Xi, although she was once a disciple of the 6 Paths Demon Gate, she had no place to go now that she had betrayed them. Naturally, she chose to stay in the Sword Dao sect. Qing Meng, on the other hand, did not have such feelings. After all, the Holy Dragon sect still existed. Qing Meng might not be willing to abandon everything and come to the Sword Dao sect. However, as Chu Fengmian's strength increased, the Sword Dao sect naturally had to annex the various forces. Chu Fengmian also wanted to annex the Holy Dragon sect. Chu Fengmian even wanted to obtain the Holy Dragon secret realm. Now, Wu Dao had been killed by Chu Fengmian. Among the younger generation of the Holy Dragon mystic realm, there was no one who was a match for Chu Fengmian. However, those old antiques in the Holy Dragon secret realm were troublesome. But now that Chu Fengmian had stepped into the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu, he could even kill a half-step celestial being expert. The moment when Chu Fengmian subdued the Holy Dragon secret realm was not far away. Since there is still some Emperor Gu's blood essence that has not been absorbed, why don't we use this opportunity to set up a new protective mountain array? Chu Fengmian looked at the remaining Emperor Gu's blood essence in the air and said. The protective mountain array was hastily set up after Chu Fengmian rushed back to the Sword Dao sect. It was only used to delay the attack of the 7 major sections. Under the attack of the 7 major sects, it was completely destroyed. Now that the Sword Dao sect had been rebuilt and Chu Fengmian had stepped into the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu's realm, his strength was completely different. The protective mountain array that he set up again would definitely be different from before. There was less than 10% of Emperor Gu's blood essence that had not been absorbed by the Sword Dao sect's mountains and rivers. It was just right to set up the protective mountain array. All right. Han Yueli was the first to speak. She displayed her countless sword techniques and turned them into streaks of sword qi that condensed in the air. In the next moment, Luo Shi, Yin Hanshi, Qing Meng, Emperor Yan, and the others all displayed their own martial techniques and condensed them in the air. Countless forces condensed in the air. Chu Fengmian also suddenly made his move. Shocking sword will and the power of the Dragon Emperor's bloodline erupted at the same time. A dragon and a sword condensed in the air and turned into yin and yang. The dragon and the sword complemented each other and turned into an incomparably huge array that shrouded the Sword Dao sect. The countless forces in the air also poured into the array. Under the dragon and the sword, each of them performed their duties and turned into the array's eye. Once the array was attacked, it would have to bear the bombardment of countless forces. This array may not be easily broken by a half-step celestial being. Luo Shi exclaimed as she looked at the array that emerged. The previous Sword Dao sect could be easily broken by a few Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. Now that the array was newly formed, even half-step celestial being experts would have to pay a great price if they wanted to attack it. Unless they were willing to pay any price or several half-step celestial being experts attacked at the same time. This mountain guarding array was enough to ensure the safety of the Sword Dao sect. Why don't we change the name of this small world to rebuild the Holy Land? Han Yueli looked at Chu Fengmian from the side and suddenly said. A name change was just right for this small world to rebuild the mountains and rivers and gain a new life. Let's call it the Sword Origin World. The origin of the Sword Dao. Master once founded the Sword Dao sect to pursue the origin of the Sword Dao. In the future, I will definitely comprehend the origin of the Sword Dao. This small world shall be the Sword Origin World in the future. Chu Fengmian said. Sword Origin World. All right. Han Yueli, Luo Shi, and the others nodded. The origin of the Sword Dao was the ultimate pursuit of countless sword cultivators. The master of the Sword Dao was the same. He never gave up and pursued the origin of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian named it the Sword Origin World to represent his determination. After 2 consecutive battles, let the disciples of the Sword Dao sect rest well. The 7 major sects won't dare to attack us for the time being. Chu Fengmian looked at the countless disciples of the Sword Dao sect below and said. The 7 major sects had suffered great losses in this battle, especially Huang Lujin, a half-step celestial being expert, who died in Chu Fengmian's hands. The 7 major sects didn't dare to bear such a loss. Moreover, even a half-step celestial being expert died in Chu Fengmian's hands. Before the 7 great sects had a clear understanding of Chu Fengmian's strength, they wouldn't dare to attack the Sword Dao Gate without full confidence. After all, the situation in the 9 regions was extremely chaotic. The 7 major sects didn't just have to deal with the Sword Dao sect. They also had to deal with the experts of the major galaxies. Chapter 1743. After the failure of the 7 sects this time, they would not come to the Sword Dao sect for a short time. This also gave Chu Fengmian and the Sword Dao sect some time to recuperate. It had only been a month since the establishment of the Sword Dao sect. Now that Chu Fengmian had created this holy land, the disciples of the Sword Dao sect would cultivate at a rapid pace. As long as the Sword Dao sect was given some time, the disciples of the Sword Dao sect would not be as weak as they were now. Even if they were not as strong as the 7 sects, they would still be able to grow into one of the strongest forces in the 9 regions. Chu Fengmian had already reshaped all kinds of things in the Sword Origin World and built a new protective array. The matter of the Sword Dao sect had come to an end for the time being. However, Chu Fengmian knew that even if the 7 major sects wouldn't attack Sword Dao sect in a short period of time, they would definitely come back once they figured out Chu Fengmian's trump card. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the more the experts of the seven sects would want to kill Chu Fengmian and obtain the foundation of the Sword Dao sect. The most important thing for Chu Fengmian was to improve his strength. Chu Fengmian had already stepped into the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. His strength was dozens of times stronger than before. Now, Chu Fengmian was truly on an equal footing with the experts of the half-step celestial realm. However, this was far from enough. Chu Fengmian had exhausted a lot of energy to defeat Huang Lujin. In the end, it was because of the Sword Cauldron that Chu Fengmian found the opportunity to kill Huang Lujin. However, if it was another half-step celestial realm expert, even the Five Elements Saber Saint who was slightly weaker than Huang Lujin, it would not be so easy for Chu Fengmian to kill him. Moreover, there was the existence of the young emperor among the half-step celestial realm experts. Even after his breakthrough, Chu Fengmian was not confident that he could defeat the young emperor. Now, Chu Fengmian could at most escape and scathe from the young emperor and contend with him. However, Chu Fengmian had not really seen the young emperor's full strength. As an expert half a step into the celestial being realm, everyone had a trump card that no one knew. For example, the Sword Cauldron on Huang Lujin was his most powerful trump card. Once the Sword Cauldron, even an expert of the half-step celestial realm would be suppressed. Chu Fengmian had a way of dealing with the Sword Cauldron. After all, the Sword Cauldron was a spiritual weapon of the Sword Dao sect. Therefore, Chu Fengmian had ways of dealing with it. However, Chu Fengmian would not be able to deal with the trump cards of Xiao Di, Five Elements Saber Saint, and the others. His current strength was far from enough. Among the seven sects, Huang Lujin's strength was definitely not the strongest. At the very least, Chu Fengmian knew that within the seven great sects, there would still be some terrifying old antiques. Huang Lujin was merely a genius disciple of the barren ancient sect 10,000 years ago. Now, he had already reached the half-step celestial being realm and was like a giant. If that was the case, how powerful would the giants of the seven great sects from 10,000 years ago be after 10,000 years? Although Chu Fengmian had made a breakthrough, he was eager to improve his strength and did not slack off. His strength was not enough for Chu Fengmian to slack off. Only by improving his strength could he resolve all the crises and even avenge the Master of Sword Dao in the future. The Sword Cauldron. Chu Fengmian looked at the Sword Cauldron in his hand and absorbed it into his body with spiritual power. The best way for Chu Fengmian to improve his strength was to refine the Sword Cauldron. The Sword Cauldron was one of the most precious treasures of the Sword Dao sect. If Huang Lujin got it, he would be able to step into the half-step celestial realm from the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. This was because Huang Lujin could not refine the Sword Cauldron and exert its power. Chu Fengmian was a disciple of the Sword Dao sect and the personal disciple of the Master of Sword Dao. He was very familiar with the Sword Cauldron. Huang Lujin could not refine it, but Chu Fengmian could. The Sword Cauldron contained an incomparably mysterious power. Chu Fengmian could not understand all the mysteries in it, but once he refined the Sword Cauldron, his strength would definitely improve a lot. Chu Fengmian's figure flickered and flew into the depths of the Cloud Feather Palace. He entered a secret room and released the Sword Cauldron. Although the Sword Cauldron was a spiritual weapon of the Sword Dao sect, it was not so easy to refine it. The more powerful a spiritual weapon was, the more difficult it was to recognize and refine it. Chu Fengmian was also clear about this. Therefore, Chu Fengmian was fully prepared. Streaks of sword essence condensed behind Chu Fengmian and suddenly turned into small golden swords that flew toward the Sword Cauldron. Extreme Sword Seal. The most basic thing to refine the Sword Cauldron was to need the power of the Master of Sword Dao, which was the Extreme Sword Seal. When the Master of Sword Dao refined the Sword Cauldron, it was to suppress the fate of the Sword Dao sect. Therefore, only the disciples of the Sword Dao sect who could condense the Extreme Sword Seal were qualified to subdue the Sword Cauldron and make it recognize them as its master. The Extreme Sword Seal was extremely mysterious. It was a mysterious restriction created by the Master of Sword Dao himself. Apart from the Master of Sword Dao and Chu Fengmian and the other disciples of the Master of Sword Dao, no one else could imitate the aura of the Extreme Sword Seal. Even the strongest sword cultivators and the old antiques of the upper sword sect could not imitate the aura of the extreme sword seal. It was also because of the extreme sword seal that the titanic divine sword and the sword cauldron were unable to recognize them as their masters even though they had fallen into the hands of others. The extreme sword seal condensed in Chu Fengmian's palm and struck the sword cauldron. The extreme sword seal approached the sword cauldron and did not bombard the restriction on the sword cauldron. Instead, it began to integrate into it. This was to awaken the sword cauldron. In order to control the power of the sword cauldron, Huang Guild had actually used some means to make the sword cauldron fall asleep. As a result, the sword cauldron's power was reduced to less than 20%. However, relatively speaking, it did not have the power to resist. To Huang Guild, even 20% of the sword cauldron's power was much better than an uncontrollable sword cauldron. As a result, the sword cauldron had been asleep for 10,000 years. If Chu Fengmian wanted the sword cauldron to recognize him as its master, the first thing he had to do was awaken it. Only by awakening the sword cauldron could he truly make it recognize him as its master. Chapter 1744. Waking up the sword cauldron was not something that could be done in a single breath. The sword cauldron had been sleeping for 10,000 years. The spirit arrays and countless runes in it were all dormant. Chu Fengmian could only use the extreme sword seal to awaken the sword cauldron bit by bit. However, during this period, Chu Fengmian could do something else. Chu Fengmian waved his hand and Huang Jiujin's figure suddenly appeared and knelt in front of Chu Fengmian. Huang Jiujin knelt on the ground with a furious look on his face. His eyes were filled with the desire to kill Chu Fengmian. However, the pressure of the dragon's power on his body made him unable to resist at all. His spiritual energy was firmly suppressed here. Under this suppression, Huang Jiujin's strength was not much stronger than an ordinary person's. An ordinary person with a spirit artifact could easily kill Huang Jiujin now. After Chu Fengmian stepped into the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, he could suppress and kill all Emperor Realm cultivators with a wave of his hand. For example, Wu Dao, Elder Chen Jian, and even Tu Chenhuang were all known as invincible emperors. Because with their strength, it was almost easy for them to kill the other Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu. But now, only Chu Fengmian deserved the title of invincible emperor. Because even if Wu Dao was reborn, Chu Fengmian could kill him with one move. This was true invincibility. Huang Jiujin struggled for a while. After finding that he could not resist, he looked at Chu Fengmian and saw the scene of Chu Fengmian refining the sword cauldron. Extreme sword seal. Boy, who are you? This extreme sword seal should only be understood by the disciple of the sword Dao master. How can you use it? The sword cauldron had fallen into Huang Jiujin's hands for 10,000 years. During these 10,000 years, Huang Jiujin had tried countless times to refine the sword cauldron and make it recognize him as its master. Because Huang Jiujin also knew that only by making the sword cauldron recognize him as its master could he exert all kinds of magical power in the sword cauldron. That was the true power of this supreme treasure. Making the sword cauldron sleep was only a method Huang Jiujin came up with after countless failed attempts. If he wanted to make the sword cauldron recognize him as its master, only those with the extreme sword seal were qualified. Ordinary disciples of the sword Dao sect were not qualified to do so. 10,000 years ago, when the sword Dao sect was destroyed, there were also some disciples who chose to betray the sword Dao sect and defected to the enemy in order to survive. The withered leaves were the same. Therefore, Huang Lujin had also sought out some disciples of the sword Dao sect, wanting to borrow their strength to refine the sword cauldron. But in the end, he came up empty-handed. The most important condition for the sword cauldron to recognize an owner was the extreme sword seal. Without the extreme Dao sword seal, unless one's strength surpassed that of the Lord of the Sword Dao, there was no way for the sword cauldron human lord to defeat him. In the past, Chu Fengmian hadn't been aware of the sword Dao master's strength. However, he had learned about it from Jianwang. The true strength of the sword Dao master was that of an immortal emperor. He was at the peak of the Ninth Order immortal realm. It was almost impossible to surpass his strength. Therefore, possessing the extreme Dao sword seal was the only way to make the sword cauldron recognize its master. However, none of the disciples of the sword Dao sect had defected to the enemy. This left Huang Lujin with no choice but to use his means to make the sword cauldron fall into a deep sleep. Now that he saw Chu Fengmian use the extreme Dao sword seal to awaken the sword cauldron, Huang Lujin was shocked speechless. He couldn't figure out what was going on even if he racked his brains. You can't figure it out? Chu Fengmian smiled when he saw Huang Lujin's expression. It was no wonder that Huang Lujin couldn't figure it out. Living two lives as a human was an illusory thing to begin with. Even the Lord of the Sword Dao couldn't do it, but Chu Fengmian did it. Chu Fengmian jumped off the heaven-ceasing peak and died, but he was reborn 10,000 years ago. Huang Lujin couldn't figure it out even if he thought about it for 10,000 years. However, Chu Fengmian was too lazy to explain. The more mysterious he acted, the more Huang Lujin was afraid of him. Huang Lujin looked at Chu Fengmian with a complicated expression, as if he couldn't see through Chu Fengmian. That was Chu Fengmian's purpose. Huang Lujin, tell me, who's still alive in your desolate ancient sect? Chu Fengmian looked at Huang Lujin and said coldly. In the battle against the Sword Dao sect 10,000 years ago, the seven sects suffered heavy losses. At least 90% of their experts were killed. But there were still some old antiques who survived. Even if these old antiques hadn't stepped into the celestial realm, their strength must have accumulated to an incredible level after 10,000 years. Chu Fengmian had completely fallen out with the seven sections. Now, he had to know his enemy and be prepared to deal with it. Boy, you don't need to know anything from me. You can't kill me anyway. It won't take long for the news to spread and my master will come to save me. Huang Lujin sneered when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Even though he was suppressed by Chu Fengmian, there was no fear on his face. He seemed to have absolute confidence that Chu Fengmian couldn't kill him. Boy, even if you've inherited the Sword Dao sect's legacy, you're still not worth mentioning in front of the seven sections. 10,000 years ago, the Sword Dao sect's master was killed by the seven sections. What are you? With your strength, you're courting death by going against the seven sections. I advise you to submit to the seven sects as soon as possible and you'll be able to keep your life. Otherwise, when the Sword Dao sect is destroyed, you'll be buried with it. Huang Lujin was fearless and threatened Chu Fengmian directly. Chu Fengmian couldn't be bothered with his threats, but he found out a secret from Huang Lujin. Master? Chu Fengmian knew who Huang Lujin's master was. He was the sect master of the desolate ancient sect 10,000 years ago, Heavenly King Huang. In the current records of the 9 regions, it was recorded that Heavenly King Huang had died in the battle against the Sword Dao sect 10,000 years ago. But according to Huang Lujin, Heavenly King Huang hadn't died? As the sect master of the desolate ancient sect 10,000 years ago, Heavenly King Huang's strength had already stepped into the half-step celestial realm. If he hadn't died, after 10,000 years of accumulation, Heavenly King Huang's strength would have reached an unbelievable level. Chu Fengmian guessed that there must be some old antiques in the desolate ancient sect, but he hadn't expected that the first person to know about them would be such a powerful figure. Chapter 1745. If Heavenly King Huang was still alive, his current strength would be even more terrifying than the young emperor's. The young emperor was known as the most promising person in the Daluo star field to reach the celestial realm. However, the young emperor was still a figure of the younger generation. As for Heavenly King Huang, he had already stepped into the half-step heavenly human realm 10,000 years ago. After the battle against the Master of the Sword Way and the great battle that destroyed the Sword Way sect, being able to survive these bloody battles would be of great help to Heavenly King Huang's strength. After 10,000 years of accumulation, Heavenly King Huang's strength would definitely reach an unimaginable level. The limit of the half-step celestial realm was far more than the young emperor's strength. Elder Fan had also said that the young emperor's strength was still some distance away from the celestial realm. Even Chu Fengmian could not handle a young emperor with his full strength. What if it was Heavenly King Huang who was even stronger than the young emperor? Chu Fengmian's joy from just now settled down. Chu Fengmian knew that there were many crouching tigers and hidden dragons in the 9 regions. Now that Chu Fengmian had stepped into the realm of the 9 tribulations, Emperor Gu, and had the strength of a half-step celestial realm, he could only protect himself. His strength was still very weak. However, no matter how strong Heavenly King Huang was, he was still a half-step celestial realm martial artist and not a celestial realm martial artist. A half-step celestial realm martial artist was not invincible. If it was a real celestial realm martial artist, Chu Fengmian would have no hope of fighting back. However, if it was a half-step celestial realm martial artist, Chu Fengmian would have a way to fight back. Chu Fengmian also had his own trump card. Whether it was the young emperor or Heavenly King Huang, Chu Fengmian could fight them to the death if they dared to fight against him. Chu Fengmian's heart was in turmoil, but his expression did not change. He looked calmly at Huang Lujin and sneered. Heavenly King Huang? Very well, I'd like to see if Heavenly King Huang can save you today. As soon as he finished speaking, Chu Fengmian suddenly attacked. Chu Fengmian would not be so stupid as to believe all of Huang Lujin's words. Perhaps this was a trick of his. Huang Lujin was fearless. Chu Fengmian wouldn't be able to get much information out of him, so he might as well kill him and find out if he was telling the truth. Huang Lujin was Heavenly King Huang's most outstanding disciple. If Heavenly King Huang was still alive, he definitely wouldn't have let Chu Fengmian kill Huang Lujin. Chu Fengmian suddenly made a move. He gathered spiritual power in his palm and slapped Huang Lujin's head with lightning speed. The Baron Gilt Gold had been suppressed by Chu Fengmian and was unable to activate its power. It was like a piece of trash without any spiritual power. A casual palm strike from Chu Fengmian was enough to kill him. Huang Lujin hadn't thought that Chu Fengmian would kill him so easily. He didn't care about his threat at all. Huang Lujin's eyes were filled with determination. Suddenly, a talisman flew out from his head. The moment the jade talisman flew out, a vast amount of energy immediately descended. The energy in the jade talisman condensed and turned into a figure in front of Huang Lujin. It was a middle-aged man with a crown on his head. Although his appearance couldn't be seen clearly, a noble aura descended. It was like a king. Even the master of a continent didn't have such an imposing aura as the figure in front of him. This was the aura of someone who had been in power for a long time. Heavenly King Huang. Chu Fengmian's expression changed the moment the jade talisman condensed into a figure. What Huang Lujin said was true. Heavenly King Huang wasn't dead. He was still alive. Chu Fengmian felt that the figure that had condensed was connected to a distant time and space. Spiritual power poured into the figure from a distant time and space. This proved that the master of the jade talisman, Heavenly King Huang, was still alive. It seems that I've underestimated this small sword Dao sect. I didn't think that they would use a jade talisman to force me to show myself. When the figure appeared, it turned into Heavenly King Huang's appearance. It was one of his incarnations. Heavenly King Huang's incarnation waved his hand in the face of Chu Fengmian's attack. A wave of ancient power immediately condensed and dispersed the spiritual power of Chu Fengmian's palm. Master, this kid can condense the extreme sword seal. Huang Lujin shouted when he saw Heavenly King Huang's incarnation. He hurriedly told Heavenly King Huang the news. Originally, the 7 major sects had thought that all the disciples of the Sword Dao sect's master were dead. Therefore, no one in the world knew about the extreme sword seal. But now, Chu Fengmian was a fish that had escaped the net. This secret was very important. The 7 major sects had destroyed the Sword Dao sect and obtained countless treasures from it. However, they didn't gain much. Most importantly, whether it was the treasures of the Sword Dao sect or the spiritual weapons of the Sword Dao sect, only the Supreme Sword Seal could unlock the seals within. If they could capture Chu Fengmian, then the Sword Dao sect's spiritual weapons that had fallen into the hands of the 7 major sects would be able to unleash their full power. That would be extremely terrifying. Whoever obtained this secret would have their strength skyrocketed. Extreme Sword Seal? When Heavenly King Huang's incarnation heard Huang Liujin's loud shout, a look of shock appeared in his eyes. Obviously, he was also shocked by the news. At the same time, a wave of greed flashed across his eyes. Of course, he knew the importance of the extreme sword seal. Destroy. Heavenly King Huang's incarnation suddenly looked at Chu Fengmian. He condensed his spiritual power and attacked Chu Fengmian with his palm. The power of Heavenly King Huang's incarnation was almost comparable to that of a real half-step celestial realm elite. This was just an incarnation that had appeared in a jade talisman. Compared to the real Heavenly King Huang, the power within was just the tip of the iceberg. With this move, the power of the ancient desolate era came crashing down from the sky. Heavenly King Huang's understanding of the ancient Tao was much stronger than Huang Liujin's. Even though they were both half-step celestial realm, the strength of the two was completely different. When Chu Fengmian saw Heavenly King Huang's attack, he didn't dare to underestimate him, even if it was just an incarnation of Heavenly King Huang. Both swords struck out. Two dazzling sword lights slashed towards Heavenly King Huang at the same time. They collided with the palm of Heavenly King Huang's incarnation in the Cloud Feather Palace. Chapter 1746. In an instant, they had exchanged thousands of blows. Then, sword light flashed. Chu Fengmian still had the upper hand. After all, this Heavenly King Huang was only a clone. Chu Fengmian's two sword lights swept across his palm and completely shattered the power of the primordial era within it. However, Heavenly King Huang was extremely cunning. He had only attacked to test the waters. If Chu Fengmian was easy to deal with, he could have subdued him and taken him to the desolate ancient sect. Now that Chu Fengmian had broken through his probing attack, Heavenly King Huang no longer fought with Chu Fengmian. Heavenly King Huang turned around and suddenly grabbed Huang Liujin. He broke the layers of seals that enveloped Huang Liujin and wanted to take him away. Huang Liujin had already learned many of Chu Fengmian's secrets after fighting with him. Huang Liujin might not be able to comprehend these secrets, but if Heavenly King Huang knew, it was very likely that he would be able to guess Chu Fengmian's identity. Heavenly King Huang was the sect master of the desolate ancient sect 10,000 years ago. He was definitely a big shot and knew the Sword Dao sect very well. Once he knew Chu Fengmian's true identity, it would be much easier to deal with Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was also deeply aware of this. His current mysterious identity was his best trump card. It was enough to deter the experts of the 7 major sects from rashly dealing with him. Therefore, Chu Fengmian naturally wouldn't let Heavenly King Huang save Huang Liujin. You want to leave? Stay here with the power of the Jade Talisman. Chu Fengmian shouted coldly. The power of the Dragon Emperor bloodline in his body was fully activated. It began to condense in the air, forming a 7-floored pagoda that suppressed Huang Liujin. Countless dragon shadows occupied the 7-floored pagoda. Every dragon shadow was a dragon emperor. With the power of countless ancient dragon emperors, it suppressed Huang Liujin. Damn little guy. The power of the Jade Talisman was fiercely suppressed. This was the origin world, Chu Fengmian's lair. It was already extremely difficult for Heavenly King Wasteland to traverse tens of millions of space-time to transfer power to this embodiment. Now that Chu Fengmian had taken action to suppress it, Chu Fengmian also used the power of the Jianwang transformation to seal the space of the origin realm. This increased the difficulty of Heavenly King Wasteland channeling power to this incarnation by countless times, cutting off the power channeled by the main body. The power contained in the Jade Talisman alone was of no use. For example, a Jade Talisman refined by a half-step Heaven Realm Master could only be used to deal with Emperor Realm Masters at most. It was of little use to other half-step Heaven Realm Masters. The 7-floored Dragon Pagoda pressed down. The Jade Talisman and Huang Liujin's figure were suppressed once again. The flame of hope that had just been ignited in Huang Liujin's heart was completely extinguished. Master, save me. Master, save me. This time, Huang Liujin was no longer as fearless as before. He shouted in panic. The biggest trump card he relied on was this jade talisman that Heavenly King Huang had once condensed. Now that the jade talisman had lost its effect, the Huang Gilt Gold could no longer remain calm. "Little bastard, you are courting death." Heavenly King Huang's incarnation in the jade talisman roared madly. He was truly enraged. Today, not only did Chu Fengmian suppress the Huang Gilt Gold, he even wanted to suppress his incarnation as well. Heavenly King Huang was an old antique who had stepped into the half-step heaven realm 10,000 years ago. His strength was unbelievably tyrannical. Now that he was being forced to such a state by a junior, how could he tolerate it? Courting death? Today, I will stand here. Heavenly King Huang, let's see what you can do to me. Chu Fengmian sneered and said disdainfully. Then, he pointed his finger and the suppression power of the seven-floored dragon pagoda became even stronger. Stop struggling. Your incarnation and the Huang Gilt Gold will become nourishment for the Origin Sword world. They will become a part of it. Under the seven-floored dragon pagoda, a colorless flame was burning fiercely. Chu Fengmian was a man of his words. Today, he was going to turn the jade talisman and the Huang Gilt Gold into nourishment for the Origin Sword world. The spiritual energy contained in the jade talisman was no less than that of an ordinary half-step heaven realm expert. Together with the essence blood of the Huang Gilt Gold, it was a great nourishment for the Origin world. Heavenly King Huang's incarnation and the Huang Gilt Gold were burning. Boom! Just at this moment, Yi Zichen was stunned. All of a sudden, the entire Cloud Feather Celestial Palace began to shake violently. The entire Sword Origin world was shaking as well. Countless pairs of eyes lifted their heads and looked at the sky. A crack could be clearly seen in the sky. The sky of the Origin Sword world was torn open. From the crack in the sky, an arm suddenly appeared. The arm seemed to have transcended time and space to arrive in the Origin Sword world. It grabbed at the jade talisman and the Huang Gilt Gold. Can't wait any longer? Has his true body arrived? Chu Fengmian looked at the arm and realized that it was Heavenly King Huang's true body. Under Chu Fengmian's continuous pressure, Heavenly King Wasteland could no longer hold himself back. He tore through space, traversing tens of millions of space-time, and sent his arm into the Origin Sword world. He wanted to save his incarnation in Huang Jin. The arm was tens of thousands of feet long. It descended in a mighty manner. No one could stop it. Along the way, countless restrictions and formations in the Sword Origin world were destroyed. Countless sword lights erupted from the mysterious black sword array and slashed at the arm. A jade-like skin appeared on the arm, easily blocking all of the sword lights. Beneath the jade-like skin, one could even see small crystals. Fleshly crystals. Chu Fengmian looked at the small crystals with a familiar gaze. They were fleshly crystals, essential for forming an immortal true body. However, compared to the 129,600 fleshly crystals Chu Fengmian had, there were only a few thousand of them. Heavenly King Huang only had a few thousand fleshly crystals. He was still far from the 129,600 fleshly crystals Chu Fengmian had. Even so, being able to transform his body into fleshly crystals meant that Heavenly King Huang had touched the threshold of an immortal true body. Although forming an immortal true body was extremely difficult, Heavenly King Huang still had a chance. This strength has indeed surpassed the young emperor's. Although this was only the strength of one of Heavenly King Huang's arms, Chu Fengmian could see that Heavenly King Huang was indeed stronger than the young emperor. Chapter 1747. The young emperor had always wanted to condense an immortal true body, but he hadn't even reached the threshold of condensing flesh and blood crystals. Heavenly King Huang had already started to condense flesh and blood crystals. Heavenly King Huang had gone much further than the young emperor on the path of condensing an immortal true body. Heavenly King Huang's body was no longer made of flesh and blood. Condensing flesh and blood crystals meant that the defensive capabilities of Heavenly King Huang's body were extremely strong. Chu Fengmian, who had also condensed flesh and blood crystals, knew this very well. However, Heavenly King Huang had underestimated Chu Fengmian if he thought that he could save Huang Jin and his clone just like that. This was the Sword Origin world. Chu Fengmian couldn't do much against Heavenly King Huang outside. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't afraid of Heavenly King Huang in the Sword Origin world. Rise! Rumble! All of a sudden, the power of the Sword Origin world erupted and shrouded Chu Fengmian's back. Chu Fengmian had created the Sword Origin world, so he was now its master. Inside the Sword Origin world, Chu Fengmian could mobilize the power of the Sword Origin world for his own use. This was something that he had only discovered after he had constructed the Sword Origin world. Chu Fengmian had no one to test his skills on, so Heavenly King Huang had delivered himself to him. Since that was the case, he would let Heavenly King Huang be the first to taste the power of the Sword Origin world. An extremely strong power gathered in Chu Fengmian's palm. The Sword Origin world was a sacred ground created by infusing the essence blood of hundreds of Emperor Gu. In terms of power, it was probably even stronger than a half-step Sky Human Realm expert. Unfortunately, the power of the Sword Origin world could only be used inside the Sword Origin world. The moment it appeared outside, its power would dissipate rapidly. However, Heavenly King Huang had used his true body to forcefully tear open space and barge into the Sword Origin world. It was the perfect time for the Sword Origin world to shine. Sky-severing Divine Sword. Boom! The power of the Sword Origin world gathered in Chu Fengmian's palm, turning into a huge sword light that soared into the sky. This huge sword light had nothing to do with Chu Fengmian's power, but was purely the power of the Sword Origin world. Wherever the sword light passed, heaven and earth were destroyed. In terms of pure strength, the Sword Origin world was even stronger than Chu Fengmian. When the sword light bombarded the huge arm, the countless flesh and blood crystals on the arm trembled violently and even showed signs of shattering. True undying bodies were not completely invincible. Bronze Heavenly Demon and Evil Blood Devil Emperor were both figures with immortal true bodies, yet they still died. Chu Fengmian also condensed a half-step immortal body, but in the previous battle, it was almost broken several times. In terms of physical strength, Heavenly King Huang's physical body was far inferior to Chu Fengmian's. After withstanding a power that exceeded its limit, the flesh and blood crystals on it were trembling violently. If not for the fact that Heavenly King Wasteland had transmitted another wave of power to this arm in a distant space-time, he would have been dead already. He was afraid that under that sword, this arm would have been sliced off. This was the power of the Sword Origin world. After condensing into a sacred land, the Sword Origin world was no longer as powerless as before. As long as he was in the Sword Origin world, Chu Fengmian could force back even the most powerful half-step Sky Human experts. You actually condensed a sacred land in such a short period of time. Good technique. Kid, it seems like I have underestimated you. Today, I will give this clone to you. However, sooner or later, you will spit it out along with its life force. Heavenly King Huang was clearly more cautious now that his arm had almost been sliced off. After realizing the power of the Sword Origin world, his arm slowly disappeared. He had already given up on the desolate gilt gold and his clone, choosing to retreat on his own accord. Chu Fengmian did not stop Heavenly King Huang from leaving. He also knew that if Heavenly King Huang wanted to leave, Chu Fengmian would not be able to keep his arm. Although the power of the Sword Origin world was strong, it could only be used within the Sword Origin world. Once the arm left the Sword Origin world, the power of the Sword Origin world would be meaningless. Within the Sword Origin world, Chu Fengmian could use the power of the Sword Origin world to gain the upper hand against Heavenly King Huang. Once he left the Sword Origin world and fought with Heavenly King Huang again, Chu Fengmian would be in an extremely disadvantageous position. After all, Chu Fengmian had just stepped into the realm of the Nine Tribulations Emperor Gu, while Heavenly King Huang was a half-step Sky Human expert who had cultivated bitterly for 10,000 years. Their foundations were not on the same level. However, in terms of power, the gap between the two was not that big. Chu Fengmian had all sorts of amazing encounters that even Heavenly King Huang could not have. Even without the power of the sword origin world, Chu Fengmian should have no problem escaping unscathed from Heavenly King Huang. Of course, an old antique like Heavenly King Huang would definitely have more trump cards than the Desolate Gilt Gold. As the former sect master of the Desolate Ancient Sect, it could be said that he had all the good things in the Desolate Ancient Sect. The Desolate Ancient Sect had dominated the 9 regions for 10,000 years and had obtained many good things. Chu Fengmian would not take the initiative to provoke Heavenly King Huang if he did not have absolute confidence in winning. However, Chu Fengmian had achieved his goal in this battle. Not only did he confirm that Heavenly King Huang was indeed still alive, but he also left his incarnation behind. The spiritual energy contained in Heavenly King Huang's incarnation was not inferior to that of a half-step sky-human expert. In addition to the Desolate Gilt Gold, Chu Fengmian could transform the origin world once again. Sect Master is invincible. Countless Sword Dao Sect disciples shouted excitedly as if they had just woken up from a dream when they saw the arm being forced back. The arm just now had forcefully torn through space and rushed into the Scissors Sect Master. In the eyes of countless Sword Dao Sect disciples, it was like the end of the world. Even Qing Meng, Emperor Yan, and Emperor Gu of the 9 Tribulations were incomparably weak in front of Heavenly King Huang. They were like ants and could not even resist. Now that Chu Fengmian had forced Heavenly King Huang's arm to retreat, everyone witnessed Chu Fengmian's strength. In their hearts, Chu Fengmian was an invincible existence. This increased the cohesiveness of countless Sword Dao Sect disciples by a lot. For a sect to unite as one, the first thing was to be strong. Only by being strong could they trust the Sword Dao Sect and be willing to fight for it. And now, Chu Fengmian had displayed an invincible strength. After experiencing a series of battles, the cohesiveness of the Sword Dao Sect was not inferior to many of the old forces in the 9 regions, even though it was just a newly established sect. Chapter 1748. The unity of the sect was extremely important. After going through a series of battles, the disciples of the Sword Dao Sect were now united. The strength of the Sword Dao Sect would definitely grow rapidly in the future. However, the backbone of the Sword Dao Sect would always be Chu Fengmian. Only when Chu Fengmian was strong enough could the Sword Dao Sect continue to exist. If the Sword Dao Sect lost Chu Fengmian, it would be destroyed by the 7 major sects in a matter of minutes. The battle with Heavenly King Huang made Chu Fengmian understand that his strength was far from enough. With the power of the Origin Sword World, Chu Fengmian could defeat Heavenly King Huang. However, he couldn't always rely on the power of the Origin Sword World. Chu Fengmian's strength had to become even stronger. Chu Fengmian glanced at the suppressed Heavenly King Huang's incarnation and waved his hand. He gathered spiritual energy and injected it into the incarnation. The consciousness that Heavenly King Huang left behind was instantly destroyed. All the energy gathered together and formed the Jade Talisman again. However, there was no consciousness in the Jade Talisman, only pure spiritual energy. Chu Fengmian moved his hand and the Jade Talisman was kept in his palm. Huang Lujin, do you have anything else to say? At the same time, Chu Fengmian looked at Huang Lujin. Huang Lujin's face was as pale as ash. When he saw Heavenly King Huang's arm being forced back by Chu Fengmian, he knew that he had completely lost all hope. Heavenly King Huang was already one of the strongest experts in the 7 major sections. If he couldn't save Huang Lujin, it would be impossible for others to do the same. Little bastard, even if I die, I'll drag you down with me. Huang Lujin's face was extremely ferocious. Suddenly, blood flowed from his eyes and his pupils exploded. The strongest part of Huang Lujin's golden divine body was his pair of golden eyes. However, Huang Lujin had actually exploded his eyes. The moment he exploded, a crack appeared in the 7-floored dragon pagoda that was suppressing Huang Lujin's body. Huang Lujin's energy gathered and rushed towards Chu Fengmian. The spiritual energy in Huang Lujin's body became extremely violent. He planned to self-destruct to take Chu Fengmian down with him. Self-destruct? You don't even have the right to self-detonate in the Sword Origin world. Be suppressed. Chu Fengmian snorted in disdain. With a wave of his hand, the power of the sword origin world came crashing down. The berserk energy within the gilded desolation body started to calm down under the power of the origin sword world. When Chu Fengmian activated the power of the sword origin world, he could even force Heavenly King Desolate to retreat. Now that he had lost his sword cauldron, Desolate Gilt Gold was at most on the same level as Doubtless. And he wanted to blow himself up in front of Chu Fengmian? Under the suppression of the power of the origin sword world, it was impossible for Huang Guilt to self-destruct. All he could do was kneel on the ground, unable to even speak. However, Huang Liujin's eyes were filled with boundless hatred. He couldn't wait to tear Chu Fengmian into pieces. However, at that moment, he could only kneel there. Even though Chu Fengmian was looking at him ferociously, he did not care at all. Boom! A burst of sword intent suddenly erupted. The source of this sword intent was the sword cauldron surrounded by countless extreme path sword seals. As the sword intent soared into the sky, the appearance of the sword cauldron changed dramatically. Ancient inscriptions appeared on the body of the cauldron. The aura of the sword cauldron alone was no weaker than that of a half-step sky-human powerhouse. This was the true form and power of the sword cauldron. Previously, when the sword cauldron was in Huang Guilt's hands, it had been in a deep slumber and contained less than 20% of its original power. Now that it had been awakened by the extreme path sword seals, the sword cauldron had returned to its original state. Let's get the sword cauldron to recognize me as its master first. Chu Fengmian had yet to decide what to do with Huang Gilt Gold, so he might as well get the sword cauldron to recognize him as its master first. The sword cauldron was once a supreme treasure of the Sword Dao sect. It was a spiritual artifact that had been personally refined by the Sword Dao master. Chu Fengmian knew very little about the mysteries of the sword cauldron. At that time, the sword cauldron was located under the heaven-ceasing peak to suppress the luck of the Sword Dao sect. Therefore, Huang Guilt had the opportunity to steal it. This was the first time Chu Fengmian had felt the power of the sword cauldron. The incomparably pure sword intent made Chu Fengmian feel extremely comfortable. He could not wait to refine the sword cauldron as soon as possible. Master. A drop of essence blood appeared in Chu Fengmian's palm and was injected into the sword cauldron. This drop of essence blood had just approached the sword cauldron when it encountered a great resistance and could not go deep. Chu Fengmian knew that this was a layer of restriction deliberately set up by the Sword Dao master to prevent outsiders from refining the sword cauldron. Only the disciple of the Sword Dao master was qualified to refine the sword cauldron. With a thought, Chu Fengmian injected a sword intent into the drop of essence blood. The extreme path sword seal emerged. The moment it sensed the extreme path sword seal, the sword cauldron slowly opened its barrier, allowing Chu Fengmian's essence blood to integrate into it. An incomparably strong power suddenly surged into Chu Fengmian's body. The sword cauldron was not a spiritual sword, but an item used to suppress providence. Compared to the Divine Nine-Dragon Cauldron, the Divine Nine-Dragon Cauldron was a medicinal cauldron. Suppressing providence was only one of its functions. The sword cauldron was created to suppress the Sword Dao sect's providence. Chu Fengmian had yet to completely refine the sword cauldron, but he could already feel the strong power within it. If the sword cauldron was placed in the origin sword world and integrated with it, it would suppress the providence of the origin sword world and increase the defensive capabilities of the origin sword world by 3 times. In fact, it was not just integrated into the origin sword world. Once it was integrated into Chu Fengmian's body, it would be enough to increase his power by countless times. It was no wonder that Huang Guilt had only put the sword cauldron to sleep and obtained a portion of the sword cauldron's power. This was enough for him to step into the half-step sky-human realm. Because of the extreme path sword seal, Chu Fengmian did not expend much effort to refine the sword cauldron. It should be said that Chu Fengmian, who possessed the extreme path sword seal, should be the owner of the sword cauldron. To Chu Fengmian, refining the sword cauldron was like taking back something that belonged to him. Naturally, it did not take much effort. Chu Fengmian had already comprehended the profoundness of the sword cauldron. Although the sword cauldron was a supreme treasure of the Sword Dao sect, it only had two functions. It could be integrated into one's body and augment one's power. It could also suppress external enemies with its suppressive power. Chapter 1749. The sword cauldron only had two functions. Now that Chu Fengmian had awakened the sword cauldron, he was faced with a difficult problem. What should he do with the sword cauldron? Suppress it in the sword principle sect? Suppress the sword principle sect's fortune? The master of sword principle had refined the sword cauldron for this purpose, but now the sword principle sect didn't need the sword cauldron to suppress its fortune. Chu Fengmian's holy land had given the sword principle sect the ability to resist external enemies. Moreover, the sword principle sect was mainly supported by Chu Fengmian, so the most important thing for Chu Fengmian was to improve his strength. However, the sword cauldron's two main functions were suppressing and fighting enemies. Chu Fengmian didn't lack means to fight enemies. He had mastered countless sword arts in the Dragon Emperor bloodline. Whether it was the 9 moves of the ancestor or Chu Fengmian's countless sword arts, he didn't lack the ability to fight enemies. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and Titanic Godly Sword in his hands were no less powerful than the sword cauldron. The sword cauldron wasn't very useful to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian could also fuse the sword cauldron into his body like the desolate gilt gold to increase his strength. Chu Fengmian felt that his strength would at least double after integrating the sword cauldron into his body. However, the increase in strength was only an external force, not Chu Fengmian's own strength. Moreover, using external forces to improve his strength would also hinder Chu Fengmian's future improvement. Huang Lujin knew that he had no hope of stepping into the half-step celestial realm, so he took the opportunity to integrate the sword cauldron into his body to advance to the half-step celestial realm. However, Chu Fengmian didn't want to do such a thing. Sword cauldron, what if I integrate the sword cauldron into the divine tree? Chu Fengmian suddenly thought of an idea while he was thinking. The divine tree in Chu Fengmian's body was of the same origin as Chu Fengmian's power. The more powerful the divine tree was, the more powerful Chu Fengmian's power was. Chu Fengmian let the divine tree devour the bronze heavenly demon skeleton before it grew to such a level. It even used the power of the heavenly bronze heavenly demon skeleton to condense flesh and blood crystal, turning it into a half-step immortal real body. The bronze heavenly demon skeleton could be considered a spiritual weapon. Once it was activated, it would be even more powerful than the sword cauldron. If the divine tree could even devour the bronze skyfiend skeleton, then the sword cauldron should not be a problem either. Thinking of this, tree branches appeared behind Chu Fengmian and formed the divine tree. He then placed the sword cauldron on top of it. Suddenly, the sword cauldron was sucked into the divine tree. Chu Fengmian could clearly see that the sword cauldron in his body had been wrapped by countless branches and leaves of the divine tree. The power of the sword cauldron had been refined by the divine tree. Sure enough, it can be refined. Seeing this scene, Chu Fengmian sighed inwardly. This divine tree was indeed a part of the builder tree. It possessed incomparably tyrannical power. It could even devour the sword cauldron. Many of the materials used to refine the sword cauldron were extremely valuable treasures. Under the refinement of the divine tree, the sword cauldron gradually began to disintegrate. A steady stream of spiritual power flowed into the divine tree. Chu Fengmian saw the divine tree growing at a speed visible to the naked eye. After devouring the sword cauldron, the power of the divine tree increased countless times. Chu Fengmian felt that the power in his body was also increasing along with the increase of the power of the divine tree. Although the increase in power might be less than that of the sword cauldron directly suppressing Chu Fengmian's body. However, the power of the divine tree was Chu Fengmian's own power. The divine tree was rooted in Chu Fengmian's body and was equivalent to a part of Chu Fengmian. The power of the sword cauldron suppressing Chu Fengmian's body was an external force. Once it encountered a tyrannical figure, it could take away the sword cauldron from Chu Fengmian's body, just like how Chu Fengmian took away the sword cauldron from Huang Lujin. The divine tree was connected to Chu Fengmian's flesh and blood. No matter how tyrannical the figure was, it was impossible to take away the divine tree from Chu Fengmian's body. In less than half an hour, Yi Zichen's expression changed. The sword cauldron had completely disappeared from Chu Fengmian's body. Not a trace of it was left. It had been completely devoured by the divine tree. Now, at a glance, the aura of the divine tree was tyrannical. It had grown hundreds of meters tall and looked even more majestic and huge. It already had the appearance of the divine tree in the divine tree's secret realm of the Sect of Desolation. Chu Fengmian felt that the power contained in the divine tree was at least equivalent to that of 3 or 4 half-step celestial being experts at the level of the 5-element Saber Saint. This power was extremely terrifying. Chu Fengmian's strength had increased by about 50%. Chu Fengmian's realm was already striding towards the peak of the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu. Of course, the growth of the divine tree did not only bring Chu Fengmian an increase in power, but also in all aspects. The 129,600 flesh crystals in Chu Fengmian's body seemed to have begun to transform under the enhancement of the divine tree's power. They were growing towards the immortal real body. The divine meridians in Chu Fengmian's body had become much thicker and the spiritual power condensed in them had become purer. Chu Fengmian slowly raised his hand and urged the power of the divine meridians to condense in the palm of his hand. An almost colorless spiritual stone appeared in Chu Fengmian's palm. This colorless spiritual stone did not contain any spiritual power, but the spiritual power in it was so pure that it did not have any impurities and did not seem to have much color. Divine Grade. This is the Divine Grade Spiritual Stone. Chu Fengmian was ecstatic when he saw the spiritual stone condensed in his hand. This was the legendary pinnacle of spiritual stones, the Divine Grade Spiritual Stone. The spiritual stones that Chu Fengmian condensed before were all divine grade spiritual stones. Even the pure divine grade spiritual stones had not reached the level of divine grade. The divine grade spiritual stone was known as the Divine Stone. It was no longer a kind of currency, but a kind of treasure. It was a priceless treasure that was necessary for setting up formations, condensing elixirs, refining spiritual weapons, and so on. Even in ancient times, such divine-grade spirit stones were extremely rare, with only a few of them in existence. Every time a divine-grade spiritual stone appeared, it would cause a storm of blood. Now that Chu Fengmian had integrated the sword cauldron into the divine tree, his divine meridians had transformed again. He could finally condense the legendary divine-grade spiritual stone. Unlike ordinary spiritual stones, the divine-grade spiritual stone was something that even the 9 Tribulations Emperor Gu and experts who were half a step away from the celestial realm yearned for. If Chu Fengmian took it out, it would be a hard currency that no one would refuse. In some ancient records, the divine-grade spiritual stone was even circulated among the celestial realm experts, which was enough to prove its value. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.